Hi guys, tonight we begin a soft journey into the life of one of history's most fascinating minds, Leonardo da Vinci. You may know him as the painter of the Mona Lisa, the designer of flying machines, or the ultimate Renaissance man. But beneath these titles is a story rich in wonder, solitude, ambition, and curiosity. In this calm 24-part exploration, we'll walk with Leonardo from his earliest memories in the hills of Vinci to the quiet rooms of French castles where he drew his last breath. With each part told slowly, tenderly, and with enough detail to lull your thoughts gently into sleep, I invite you to relax, lie back, and float with me through the gentle stream of Leonardo's life. Let's begin, where all stories begin, at the very start. It was the spring of 1452 in the rolling hills of Tuscany near the small town of Vinci. The light was soft that April morning, as if the earth knew it was about to welcome someone extraordinary. Leonardo was born on the 15th of that month, not in a palace or noble court, but in a farmhouse nestled near the village of Anciano. His mother, a young peasant girl named Caterina, held him gently, unaware of the centuries of awe her child would inspire. His father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was a well-respected notary, and though he did not marry Caterina, he would eventually bring the young Leonardo into his home. Leonardo's early years were wrapped in the quiet sounds of nature, the rustling of olive trees, the rhythmic cooing of doves, the steady hum of bees around wildflowers. He was surrounded not by grandeur, but by simplicity, the kind of simplicity that nourishes imagination. Even as a small child, Leonardo was curious. He watched insects for hours, fascinated by the delicate transparency of their wings. He followed water streams, observing how they bent around rocks, how light played on their surfaces. His earliest memories were not just sights, but patterns, motion, beauty in tiny details. Because he was born out of wedlock, Leonardo could not attend the formal Latin schools his half-brothers later did. At first, this may have seemed a disadvantage, but perhaps it freed his mind from the rigid scholastic traditions of the day. He taught himself, or rather, he learned by observing, by sketching, by wondering. He studied the way birds flew, how the wind curved their feathers in the air. He noticed the way muscles pulled skin, the way shadows moved across walls at different hours. His mind was never still. Even at 6 or 7 years old, he was more enchanted with the mystery of how things worked than the names given to them. His father, Ser Piero, saw this. Though he may have not fully understood his son's mind, he recognized the spark. Around the age of 5, Leonardo left his mother's household and began living with his father in Vinci proper, a larger home, a more stable setting. His stepmother, Albiera, was kind, and though she never bore children of her own, she treated Leonardo with affection. The boy grew up in a blended world, half between the peasants of his mother's village and half among the more refined company his father kept. He spent hours walking alone. The Tuscan countryside was his first studio, his first classroom. The layers of bark on a tree, the way dew gathered on grass in the early morning, the curve of a snail shell, they all whispered lessons to him. And he listened. Often he would bring back little treasures, stones with strange veins, bird feathers, twisted roots. He kept them in a small wooden box, hidden under his bed, where he could examine them in quiet moments. But perhaps the greatest treasure was drawing. Leonardo could draw before he could write properly. He drew animals, landscapes, human faces, not as symbols, but as living things. When he drew a cat, it looked ready to pounce. When he sketched a storm, you could feel the thunder in the curves of his lines. And yet, no one had yet taught him technique. It was all instinct, observation, love. Around the age of 12, his drawings had become so astonishing that his father brought a few to Florence, the city of gold and stone, of artists and thinkers, of Medici lords and ancient cathedrals. Ser Piero showed the sketches to his acquaintances, and eventually they reached the hands of Andrea del Verrocchio, a master sculptor, goldsmith and painter with a bustling workshop in Florence. Verrocchio was impressed. This boy, he said, had potential, real potential, perhaps even more. And so in the haze of city sounds and echoing church bells, Leonardo entered the world of formal art. He became a student in Verrocchio's studio, a place full of clay, marble dust, and light bouncing off polished metal. It was a transformative moment, one that would open doors not only in technique, but in imagination. Yet still, He carried Vinci within him. Even as he learned the rules of form and perspective, his drawings often wandered into inventions, into flights of fancy, into things no one had seen before. At Verrocchio's side, he learned not just painting, but sculpture, mechanics, chemistry, and anatomy. A Renaissance workshop was like a universe, and for a mind like Leonardo's, that meant endless orbit. He watched how bronze was melted, how pigments were mixed, how canvas was stretched and cured. Every task was a discovery, every failure a question to be solved. Though he was shy, he was also magnetic. People in the workshop noticed the way he moved, graceful, deliberate. He spoke with a softness, but his words were precise, often poetic. He loved animals, detested cruelty, and was known to buy birds in cages just to set them free. There was something untamed in him, even in the city, a wildness, but not in manner, in thought, in dreams. And as he grew, that wildness began to take shape, in drawings of flying machines, water pumps, fantastical cities. While others copied the forms of the masters, Leonardo looked beyond them. He didn't want to repeat beauty, he wanted to understand it. One day, Verrocchio was commissioned to paint the baptism of Christ. He assigned Leonardo the task of painting one of the angels in the corner. Leonardo's angel was so exquisitely rendered, so alive, that it is said Verrocchio never painted again. Whether that's myth or truth, no one can say for sure. But the story endures. Because looking at the angel, the lightness of its expression, the softness of its curls, it's clear something had shifted. A boy from Vinci had arrived in the heart of Florence, and the world was beginning to notice. And so, as night gently settles over the hills of Tuscany, we leave young Leonardo at the cusp of change. Still a boy, but already a master in the making. In the next part, we'll follow his journey through Florence, a city of power and splendor, and watch as his genius begins to bloom in the company of scholars, merchants, and visionaries. But for now, close your eyes. Imagine the wind in the olive trees, the soft footsteps of a boy walking a sun-dappled trail, and rest, knowing that this is only the beginning. The city of Florence, in the late 1460s, was alive in a way few other places in the world were. It pulsed with energy, the kind that thrived in sunlit piazzas and behind thick stone walls where artists, philosophers, and engineers sketched ideas that dared to stretch beyond the known. As Leonardo settled into life within Verrocchio's workshop, his days began to change, marked now by structure, expectation, and a pace driven not by wandering curiosity, but by commissions and deadlines. Still, something in him thrived here. The studio became his new landscape, filled not with olive trees, but with potential. The workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio was no ordinary place. It was an epicenter of craft and innovation. Apprentices there learned by doing, preparing pigments, carving wooden supports for paintings, polishing sculptures until they gleamed like wet stone. They also copied their master's work until their hands understood the shapes before their minds did. Leonardo, ever precise, absorbed everything with a hunger that made others stop and watch. He would rise early before the bells rang out across the rooftops. Sometimes he would spend an entire morning simply grinding minerals into pigment, azurite for blues, malachite for greens, crushed insects for crimson reds. He loved the tactile nature of it all. His fingers often bore the stains of his tasks, and yet he treated every material with reverence, as if each carried a secret waiting to be unlocked. Under Verrocchio's guidance, he learned the laws of perspective, a science of space and light. But Leonardo didn't stop at knowing where to place a vanishing point. He experimented, bending those rules to mimic the soft blurring of the human eye. He noticed that things in the distance were not only smaller, but also fuzzier, tinted with blue. And so he invented his own atmospheric perspective, one that would eventually become his signature. At night, when the studio was quiet and the lamps were lit with oil, Leonardo stayed behind. He would sketch alone by the flickering light, his notebooks filling with pages of thoughts. A flying machine inspired by bats, a water-lifting device, faces of people he had seen in the marketplace, studies of horses, cats, and coils of rope. Sometimes he drew knots endlessly, fascinated by their interlocking lines. Other times he returned to anatomy, not from a textbook, but from watching real life. His fascination with the human body only deepened. When he wasn't drawing, he observed how old men leaned as they walked, how children twisted when they played. He believed that understanding the mechanics of the body would unlock a new depth in art. It was not enough to copy nature. One had to know it, the way a musician knows their instrument inside and out. His angel on Verrocchio's The Baptism of Christ had marked a turning point. Though only a detail in the overall work, it whispered of something new, something not seen before. Its face held emotion, not dramatized but quiet, alive. Its expression was serene but complex, as if aware of a thought too subtle for words. Florence took notice, quietly at first, but growing louder. And yet, Leonardo remained quiet. Shy, even. He was not one to boast. He dressed well, too well, some said, favouring pinks, purples and rich fabrics that whispered of elegance. He kept his hair long, curling past his shoulders, and his presence carried a certain gentleness. People were drawn to him, but he often kept his thoughts closely guarded. He was also left-handed, which was rare and even viewed with suspicion in some corners. But instead of trying to conform, he leaned into it. He wrote in mirror script, backwards and right to left, perhaps to keep others from reading his notes, perhaps just because it felt natural. Whatever the reason, it added to his air of mystery. Florence, though radiant, was not without tension. Political currents swirled beneath the art and music. The Medici family, powerful and wealthy, shaped the city with their influence and their patronage. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Il Magnifico, ruled not by title but by respect and fear. Artists, thinkers and poets found refuge under his sponsorship, and his favour could change the course of a man's life. Leonardo's name began to circulate among those who mattered. Whispers of his talent reached beyond the studio. His drawings, passed hand to hand, began to stir awe, not for their flamboyance, but for their depth. He was soon offered commissions of his own, though still young and unproven. One of the first was an altarpiece for the Chapel of St. Bernard. He began the work eagerly, sketching madly, experimenting with composition, expression and symbolism. But as with many projects in his life, it was never completed. Leonardo, even then, was haunted by an impossible standard, one that lived in his mind's eye. He would begin with passion, but often abandon work midstream, either distracted by a new idea or simply unsatisfied with what he had created. Perfection, for him, wasn't a goal. It was a prison. Still, his talent couldn't be ignored. He painted Annunciation, a piece that showed his grasp of light, of delicate hands, of the divine made human. The angel, once again, was unlike the stiff, symbolic forms of the past. This angel knelt with grace, its wings rendered with startling precision, each feather delicately placed. Mary looked surprised, not robotic, real, alive. More commissions followed, portraits, religious scenes, sketches for architecture. And yet, something always tugged at him from the edge of the page. Invention. He began thinking more about machines, about how to bend nature to human will. He watched birds more carefully, sketched wings from every angle, theorized about lift and air pressure long before the words for such things were common. He wasn't just dreaming, he was engineering. Florence was fertile ground, but also crowded with talent. Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and Filippino Lippi were making names for themselves. Even Michelangelo, much younger, was beginning to appear on the horizon. Leonardo's pace, slow, methodical, deliberate, meant that others often surpassed him in visibility. Still, those who knew, knew. They knew that there was something different about him, something deeper. His notebooks began to swell with words and drawings, thoughts on motion, on geometry, on optics. He studied water, how it flowed, how it swirled. He believed water held secrets, perhaps even the secret of life itself. He sketched eddies, waves, droplets in midair. Some days he would simply watch the Arno River for hours, tracking the dance of foam across the surface. Yet for all this brilliance he struggled. Commissions delayed, money uncertain, and the pressure to finish things he no longer felt passionate about. He felt Florence's beauty, but also its limits. He needed space, a new canvas. And when an opportunity came, a summons from the powerful Duke of Milan, Leonardo accepted. He would leave behind the city of his youth, the workshop where his craft had bloomed, and step into a new world. A world of military engineers, grand court spectacles and machines of war. A place where art met science, where ambition wore armour, and where Leonardo would become not just a painter, but a visionary architect of dreams. But before he could begin again, he would look back once more. at the streets of Florence, at the marble steps of the Duomo, at the friends and rivals he was leaving behind. And as he crossed the hills that separated Florence from Milan, he carried with him not just sketches, but questions. Always questions. And so our story floats onward, following a young man cloaked in mystery and talent, walking toward destiny with quiet footsteps, eyes wide open to the marvels ahead. Let your breath slow. Let the images melt into sleep. Tomorrow, we'll follow Leonardo through the gates of Milan into the court of Ludovico Sforza, where new wonders and new burdens await. Leonardo da Vinci arrived in Milan in the year 1482, a city that pulsed with a very different rhythm than Florence. Where Florence dazzled with its classical beauty and intellectual warmth, Milan stood colder, more guarded, a city shaped by militarism, ambition, and towering brick walls. But Leonardo did not come simply as a painter. He came with a letter. A self-authored introduction so striking in its audacity and foresight that it would later become one of the most extraordinary cover letters in history. In that letter, he offered not paintings, not portraits or frescoes, but machines. 10 paragraphs listed his skills in military engineering: bridges light yet strong, unassailable fortresses, mortars that released smoke to disorient enemies, vessels to navigate rivers unseen, and siege weapons built to shock and terrify. Only in the final line, as though a humble aside, did he mention that he could also paint and sculpt and create work in marble, bronze or clay. This was not a plea. It was a proposal. The man he addressed it to was Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, the Moor, a shrewd and calculated ruler with ambitions not only for Milan's political dominance but also for its cultural prestige. Ludovico understood the value of spectacle, of appearances. He sought not merely a court artist but someone who could awe. And in Leonardo he found a mind that mirrored his ambition. And so Leonardo entered service at the Sforza court. His role at first was not to paint but to design, to orchestrate elaborate festivities, theatrical sets, and ingenious devices to dazzle visiting nobles. His talents, like his inventions, were on display. He constructed rotating stages, mechanical birds, fountains that changed shape, even illusions of celestial phenomena descending from ceilings. These entertainments were more than mere diversion. They were political theatre, designed to project Milan as a city of marvels. Leonardo observed this new world quietly. Milan was a city of shadows as well as light. Intrigue threaded its streets and alliances shifted like smoke. The court was filled with nobles, architects, military men, musicians, alchemists. Some whispered behind hands, others maneuvered with smiles. Leonardo, with his calm demeanor and enigmatic charm, fit nowhere and everywhere all at once. Yet despite the grandeur, he found himself drawn, again and again, to solitude. When not engaged in courtly duties, he wandered the Lombardy countryside. He walked along the canals, examining the lock systems, sketching bridges and embankments. He studied the shape of trees, how their branches spiraled upward, mimicking the flow of blood vessels he would later dissect. He watched storms roll across distant fields, then tried to capture their momentum in ink. In Milan, his notebooks expanded exponentially. Pages filled with mechanical diagrams, anatomical studies, plant morphology, and endless questions. How do birds soar without falling? Why do muscles bulge where they do? What makes a smile beautiful or unsettling? He dissected not only creatures but ideas. Every line drawn was a thought unpacked. And yet the project that would dominate his time in Milan began not with a sketch, but with a promise, a monument. Ludovico wanted a tribute to his father, Francesco Sforza, a colossal equestrian statue unlike anything seen since ancient Rome. It was to be the largest bronze horse in the world. Leonardo accepted the commission, and thus began a journey of years, of triumph, frustration, and ultimately heartbreak. He began by studying horses obsessively. He sketched them in every pose, every emotion, standing, galloping, rearing, resting. He visited stables, spoke with riders, even created clay models to test the musculature. The challenge was immense. Bronze casting at such a scale required not only artistic vision, but an engineer's precision. The horse would stand over 24 feet tall. It had to balance. It had to breathe life, even in stillness. As he toiled over the model, the Sforza court continued to shift. Politics grew tense. The French were eyeing Milan. Resources, once lavishly offered, grew thin. Leonardo completed a full-scale clay model, an extraordinary achievement in itself. It was displayed publicly, and people gasped at its power. The horse, as it came to be known, became a symbol of Milanese pride. But then war came. The French invaded. Bronze once earmarked for the casting was instead diverted to make cannons. Leonardo watched as years of work, of sketches, dreams, and sculpted muscle were frozen in clay. When the French soldiers arrived, they used the model for target practice. Arrows thudded into the flank of the great horse until it crumbled. Leonardo said nothing. He merely turned the page. There was, however, a painting that began during this Milanese chapter, one so haunting and mysterious that it would live in legend. The Last Supper. Commissioned for the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, it was a sacred work, a portrayal of Jesus and his disciples at the moment of betrayal. But Leonardo, true to form, did not approach it as others would have. He didn't simply illustrate. He orchestrated. He studied expressions, emotions, human reaction. Each apostle is caught mid-thought, mid-movement. Shock, grief, disbelief ripple outward from Christ like a stone in water. Jesus, serene and centered, forms a triangle, a symbol of divinity. The composition draws the eye to him, even as chaos blooms around him. But Leonardo, ever the experimenter, used an untested technique for the wall, layering tempera and oil on dry plaster rather than wet. It allowed for finer detail, but at a cost. The painting began to deteriorate within years. Still, its impact could not be denied. The Last Supper wasn't just a mural, it was a study of the soul, and so the years in Milan wore on. A dance of creation and interruption. Projects were started and abandoned, inventions sketched but never built. Friends came and went. Yet through it all, Leonardo remained curious, observant, never bitter. Even as politics fractured around him, even as patrons failed to fulfill promises, he kept drawing, kept asking. Toward the end of his time in Milan, Leonardo adopted a young assistant, a boy named Gian Giacomo Caprotti, but whom Leonardo nicknamed Salai, or Little Devil. Salai was clever, handsome, and mischievous. Their relationship would stretch for decades, marked by affection, quarrels, and mystery. Leonardo's household now included not only Salai, but pupils, patrons, animals, and the constant sound of turning pages. But Milan was no longer safe. In 1499, the French returned, this time with full force. Ludovico Sforza fled, the city fell. And with it, Leonardo's place in the court dissolved. He gathered what he could. Notebooks, paintings, unfinished projects, and left Milan behind. The horse was gone. The court dispersed. The studio emptied. He was nearly 50. Most men of that time would have peaked, settled, or faded by now. But Leonardo was different. His mind, always younger than his years, still overflowed with plans. He had lost a city, but he had not lost his vision, and so he wandered again, a familiar rhythm now. Through Mantua, through Venice, and finally back to Florence, where another chapter awaited. A new rivalry, a new painting, a smile that would change the world. But for now, rest with the image of the great horse standing in the Milanese air just before the fall, a monument not to victory, but to vision, to a man who dared to sculpt the impossible. And tomorrow we'll walk beside him once more, through the hills of Florence and into the making of a masterpiece. Leonardo returned to Florence in the early years of the new century, around 1500. He was nearly 50 years old now, a mature man, bearded and solemn, though still graceful in movement and striking in appearance. Florence had changed in his absence, just as he had. The city no longer hummed with the innocence of artistic revival. Instead, it throbbed with rivalries and ambition, spiritual reformers and political unrest. Yet it welcomed him, quietly but attentively, as if an old friend had returned from a long, mysterious voyage. He arrived with little more than his notebooks, his memories, and a reputation that had, if anything, grown in myth during his years in Milan. He had no great titles, no property, and yet his name drew whispers of reverence. The man who painted The Last Supper, the mind that designed flying machines and impossible statues. Florence remembered. But it wasn't only Florence that had changed. It was Leonardo himself. He walked differently now. Not from age or injury, but from perspective. The world had become more fragile to him, more interconnected. His eyes searched less for fame and more for meaning. He was still fascinated by form, but more and more he turned inward, to light, to thought, to spirit. He was offered residence by the monks of Santissima Annunziata, who granted him a space to live and work. It was a quiet sanctuary, ideal for a man who now preferred thought to applause. There he was given a commission to paint a devotional image for the high altar. He accepted it with a familiar mix of intensity and hesitation. The work he began was The Virgin and Child with St. Anne, a composition that would evolve slowly, intricately, obsessively. In this painting, Leonardo chose to depict a subtle but deeply human moment, St. Anne watching her daughter Mary, who in turn watched her own son, Jesus, play with a lamb. But beneath that simplicity lay a cascade of emotion. The twisting bodies, the triangular structure, the way light draped across their faces, all combined to form a spiritual intimacy rarely seen. As always, Leonardo sketched relentlessly, his notebooks filled with variations of heads tilted, fingers reaching, eyes turning inwards. He did not finish the painting then. It remained with him for years, an idea still blooming. And perhaps that was how he preferred it. The work as a living thing, never static, always evolving. But Florence was not the quiet retreat he remembered. The city was alive with tension and with talent. Most notably, a younger artist had risen to fame, Michelangelo Buonarroti. Brilliant, volatile and fiercely proud, he had already carved the Pietà, and now the colossal David stood in the Piazza della Signoria, a symbol of Florence's power and defiance. Michelangelo and Leonardo could not have been more different. One chiseled fury into marble, the other breathed light into paint. One moved through the world with blunt passion, the other with veiled mystery. They respected each other's skill, but there was little warmth between them. The city, sensing a story, fanned the flames of their rivalry, and soon that rivalry would be tested. In 1503, the Republic of Florence announced a grand project. The Hall of 500 in the Palazzo Vecchio would be adorned with frescoes celebrating Florentine military victories. Two artists were chosen, Leonardo and Michelangelo. 2 walls, 2 masters, 1 stage. Leonardo was assigned the Battle of Anghiari, Michelangelo the Battle of Cascina. Neither subject was serene. Both were scenes of war, of chaos, of men locked in conflict. Leonardo accepted the task with interest, though not without anxiety. Large wall frescoes had never been his strength. The Last Supper, while beautiful, had already shown the limitations of his technique. Still, he approached this new challenge with typical invention. He designed an intricate scaffolding system. He researched new materials. He studied horses again, their rage, their terror, their muscle and movement. He dissected expressions of fury, sketched hands grasping, bodies colliding. The central scene he planned was unforgettable. A violent clash over a stolen standard, men tangled like vines, faces twisted in desperation. But again, the materials betrayed him. Leonardo, ever the experimenter, tried a technique involving wax and oil to extend drying time and allow finer details. But the wall absorbed the oil too slowly. The colours ran, moulds grew. Heat from nearby fires, meant to quicken drying, caused the paint to drip. The image began to fade before it had even begun. He abandoned the project. Michelangelo never even started his wall. He left for Rome shortly after, and so the great artistic duel fizzled out, leaving behind sketches, fragments and echoes. Florence had dreamed of glory. Instead, it received ghosts. But in the same year, quietly, almost without notice, Leonardo began a small portrait, a commission from a wealthy Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. The subject, his wife, Lisa. Leonardo would work on that painting for years. It would never leave his side. Mona Lisa. She is not painted in grandeur, no jewels, no palace. She wears a modest dress. Her background is dreamlike, mountains, winding rivers, a bridge almost hidden in the haze. But it is her face that holds the mystery. Her smile so subtle it seems to appear only when you look away. Her gaze, following, inviting, knowing. Leonardo didn't just paint a woman. He captured a thought halfway formed, a feeling just before it reaches the lips. He used a technique he had perfected, sfumato, the smoky blurring of edges, allowing tones to shift like breath. Her skin seems to glow, not with colour, but with light remembered. Every brushstroke holds patience. Love. Curiosity. He never gave the painting to the commissioner. He carried it with him for the rest of his life, touching it up, refining details, endlessly adjusting, not because it wasn't finished, but because perhaps it was never meant to be. During this time, he also delved deeper into anatomy. With permission, he began dissecting bodies at the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova. What he saw there left him in awe. He sketched muscles, veins, the chambers of the heart. He recorded the age of his subjects, the conditions of their deaths, the texture of the liver, the branching of nerves. These weren't just medical studies. They were poems in ink. One night he wrote of an old man who had died quietly in the hospital. Leonardo had performed the autopsy himself and afterward wrote, "This is the end of the man who at the age of more than 100 years died without any movement, without any sign of distress, sitting on a bed in the hospital. I dissected him to see the cause of so sweet a death." Such was Leonardo's mind, never morbid, only curious. Even death was a puzzle worth understanding. But even as his notebooks thickened, his health began to waver. He wrote less frequently. His hands, once so precise, began to tire more quickly. Florence, for all its beauty, began to feel smaller. The commissions slowed, the politics grew heavier. And so, when an offer came, an invitation from the King of France, Leonardo accepted. He was older now, his beard white, his step slower, but his mind still teemed with plans. He left Florence one last time, carrying with him his notes, his memories, and a small portrait of a woman who never stopped smiling. Ahead, the Loire Valley awaited. Castles, rivers, and a king who believed in his genius. In the quiet gardens of Amboise, Leonardo would live his final years. But before that, a new journey, a final chapter. And tonight, as you drift, imagine Florence by moonlight, its stone streets hushed, its cathedral dome silhouetted against the stars. And Leonardo walking with measured steps, carrying the unfinished dreams of a lifetime in the folds of his robe. The journey to France began in the autumn of 1516. Leonardo, now 64 years old, boarded a mule-drawn carriage, accompanied by a small but meaningful entourage. His loyal assistant, Francesco Melzi, a refined and educated young man, a few trunks of notebooks, sketches and tools, and, of course, the ever-mysterious painting of a woman with the knowing smile. As they crossed the Alps, leaving the rolling hills of Tuscany behind, Leonardo's thoughts must have swirled with memories, not only of Florence and Milan, but of the years, the faces, the questions that had followed him like shadows. France at the time was in a state of cultural blossoming. The new king, Francis I, was young, passionate about the arts, and eager to elevate his court to rival the great Renaissance cities of Italy. He had heard tales of the old master, the painter of miracles, the inventor of dreams, the man whose genius had no borders. And so he extended an invitation to Leonardo, not as a mere artist, but as premier peintre, ingénieur et architecte du roi, the king's first painter, engineer and architect. Leonardo accepted with quiet grace. The years had taught him that beginnings often wore the robes of endings. His health was waning. One of his hands had grown weak, perhaps paralyzed by a stroke, but his mind remained vast, luminous, forever in motion. They settled in a manor house called Clos Lucé, nestled in the green heart of the Loire Valley near the royal chateau of Amboise. It was a peaceful, elegant residence with thick stone walls, winding staircases, and windows that opened onto flowered gardens and shaded courtyards. Francis I ensured Leonardo wanted for nothing. He was granted a pension, servants, a studio, and, most of all, freedom. The manor became his sanctuary. Though no longer as physically active, Leonardo surrounded himself with the instruments of his past. Mechanical models, anatomical drawings, hydraulic sketches, pages upon pages of questions. Francesco Melzi cared for him with quiet devotion, organizing his notes, transcribing his thoughts, and easing the burden of aging hands. Leonardo's days in Clos Lucé were slow, measured, but not idle. He met often with King Francis, who adored their conversations. The king would visit Leonardo in the afternoons, listening with boyish fascination to his theories on art, architecture, the movement of the planets, the nature of the soul. Francis saw not just an old man, but a living treasure, a monument of wisdom carved by time and solitude. Leonardo showed him designs for ideal cities, layouts that promoted hygiene, airflow, and social harmony. He spoke of machines that could harness rivers, of bridges that could be built and unbuilt in hours. Though few of these ideas were ever constructed, the very presence of the mind that created them enchanted the young monarch. Sometimes Leonardo walked in the gardens of Clos Lucé, slow and contemplative, pausing to observe a bee on a flower, or to trace the path of an ant up a tree. The world had never lost its mystery for him. If anything, his awareness of its complexity had deepened with age. He knew, perhaps more than ever, how much he did not know. He often revisited his old works, not physically, but in thought. He spoke rarely of the lost horse of Milan, but once wrote in a quiet moment, "The horse shall have wings." Whether it was hope or irony, no one could say. He touched up the Mona Lisa even then, adjusting the shadows under her eyes, the soft blur of her cheek. The painting had become more than art. It was a companion, a mirror of his own mysteries. Though his body slowed, Leonardo's curiosity burned gently in the evenings. Candlelight spilled across his pages as he dictated observations to Melzi, reflections on rivers, clouds, fossils. He had begun to write more about the elements, fire, air, water, earth, not as a philosopher, but as one who had touched them, studied their movements, loved their chaos. He also began to reflect more on death, not with dread, but with quiet fascination. He believed the body to be a vessel of nature, a machine of divine engineering, and just as all machines reach their rest, so too would he. But the soul, he thought, moved onward, perhaps into the air, perhaps into light. There is a story, and it may be true, or simply kind, that Francis I was at Leonardo's bedside when he died, that the king held him in his arms as the breath left his body, that the old master, surrounded by silence and affection, simply closed his eyes and departed without struggle. He died on May 2nd, 1519, at the age of 67. Word of his passing rippled across Europe, soft but heavy, not with the fanfare of royalty, but with the hush reserved for the deeply revered. Francesco Melzi was named his heir, entrusted with the vast labyrinth of Leonardo's notes, over 7,000 pages of drawings, musings, observations, riddles. Not all would survive. Some would be lost, others sold, scattered, buried beneath dust. But many would endure. Enough to ensure that Leonardo's spirit would echo long after his voice fell silent. He was buried in the chapel of Saint-Florentin, near the Château d'Amboise. The chapel itself was later destroyed during the French Revolution, and his bones, like many, were displaced. But a gravestone remains today, marked simply with his name, Leonardo da Vinci. No titles, no boast, just a name that, even centuries later, whispers through time. And yet, perhaps his true resting place is not in stone, but in the questions he left behind. The spiral of a seashell, the muscles of a horse's leg, the smile of a woman who has seen the future and chooses to say nothing. Leonardo once wrote, "As a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so a life well used brings happy death." His days were full, his questions were many, his answers incomplete, but beautiful. So tonight, rest knowing that the old man in the manor by the river slept at last, his work done, his light dimmed, but never extinguished. And tomorrow we will begin to walk backwards through his dreams, the inventions, the machines, the unbuilt worlds he imagined in silence. Because the life of Leonardo da Vinci was not just what he did, but what he dared to imagine. The dreams Leonardo da Vinci left behind did not sleep with him. They lingered in the corners of his notebooks, curled like vines around the pages, whispering ideas that would take centuries to unfold. Though his body now rested beneath the soil of France, his imagination stretched far beyond the limits of his time, into realms of invention, physics, and engineering. Tonight, we step gently into that realm. Not the paintings, not the portraits, but the blueprints of what could have been. Leonardo's machines were not confined by the materials of his era. They danced on the edge of impossibility. And yet they were drawn with the precision of someone who had not merely dreamed them, but believed in them. His sketches did not look like fancies. They looked like instructions. One of his earliest obsessions was flight. From his youth in Vinci, Leonardo had watched birds with the eye of a poet and the mind of a physicist. He noticed the angle of their wings as they glided, how the air curved beneath feathers, how small adjustments in motion could yield graceful, soaring arcs. He believed that to fly was not divine, it was mechanical. It was simply a matter of understanding, and so he filled pages with flying machines. There were wings shaped like those of bats, complete with pulleys and levers to mimic the flex of tendons. There were aerial screws, long before the word helicopter was ever uttered, imagined as spinning devices that would lift a person off the ground. There were gliders, parachutes and ornithopters, machines with flapping wings powered by the motion of a man's legs. Each sketch came with notes, some in reverse script, some in open musing. He wrote not only how the machines would function, but why they might fail. He was skeptical of his own designs, always revising, questioning. He did not claim to have conquered the sky, but he longed for its logic. He never built these machines to fly. No one did, not in his time. The materials were too heavy, the muscle power of a man too limited. But the principles? They were sound. And hundreds of years later, when others would build wings that worked, they would turn to Leonardo's pages and see that he had already imagined them. Then there were the machines of war, designs far removed from the grace of birds, and yet rendered with the same care. Leonardo, like many artists of his age, was no stranger to warfare. Italy was a tapestry of shifting alliances, mercenary armies, and siege after siege. Patrons demanded not only beauty, but utility. Survival. Leonardo obliged, reluctantly. He designed cannons with adjustable angles, tanks shaped like armored turtles, multi-barreled guns that could fire in rapid sequence. He sketched portable bridges for crossing rivers, defensive walls with hidden walkways, even underwater diving suits that allowed men to breathe while sabotaging ships from below. And yet, tucked into these pages were notes of unease. In one he wrote, "I will not publish or divulge these methods because of the evil nature of men who would use them for war." It was a contradiction that ran deep in his soul, the urge to invent and the horror at what invention could become. He wanted to understand everything, but he feared what others might do with that understanding. Not all his machines were meant for battle or sky. Some were whimsical, others visionary. He designed automatic devices for theatrical productions, moving sets, lifting platforms, mechanical dragons that could exhale fire. He created water clocks, crank-operated carts, gear systems that could mimic walking. One design, a humanoid automaton, armor-clad and capable of sitting, waving and opening its jaw, would later be reconstructed and proven to work. A robot, centuries ahead of its time. He studied gears, pulleys, cams. He drew intricate cross-sections of machines, as if slicing open the bones of steel and wood to reveal their secrets. Every cog had a reason, every lever a logic. He wasn't guessing, he was deducing. Many of these inventions existed only as sketches. The notebooks, often chaotic, sometimes cryptic, were Leonardo's laboratory. He wasn't building machines, he was building understanding. His fascination with water was just as deep as his obsession with air. He called water the driving force of all nature. He sketched wave patterns, currents, eddies. He designed systems to irrigate fields, to drain marshes, to purify drinking water. He imagined vast canals linking cities and locks to raise and lower boats. One plan envisioned a city restructured around water, with underground canals for waste and upper streets for living and trade. This ideal city would be clean, organized, harmonious. In it, nature and human life flowed together, not in opposition, but in design. He was centuries too early. But the beauty of Leonardo's mind was not in what he finished, it was in what he saw. The potential, the unfolding shape of a better world. He saw machines not as ends, but as extensions of human curiosity. And in those machines there was often poetry. He once sketched a device for measuring the humidity in air, another to record wind speed. Tools for reading nature, not conquering it. His inventions were rarely about domination, they were about listening. Still, for all their brilliance, his designs remained scattered. No grand compendium, no polished archive. Just page after page, found decades later in trunks, in collections, in the back rooms of forgotten libraries. Historians and engineers would spend lifetimes decoding them, assembling fragments into understanding. And yet, even in fragment, Leonardo's vision endured. So tonight, imagine those pages spread across a wooden table by candlelight, a feather quill beside an inkwell, a circle half drawn, a wing in motion, and an old man staring not at the candle, but at the flame itself, wondering what made it dance. Leonardo did not build the machines that would change the world. He dreamed them. And dreams, when drawn in ink, have a way of flying, long after their dreamer sleeps. Leonardo's hunger to understand the world was never confined to the visible. Just as he explored the skies with his flying machines and the water with his hydraulic designs, so too did he dive into the most mysterious terrain of all, the human body. In this chapter of his life, Leonardo became not just an artist or engineer, but an anatomist. A silent seeker, peeling back the surface of flesh to find the architecture of life itself. It began, as many of his pursuits did, with observation. From his earliest paintings, Leonardo had displayed an uncanny ability to depict the human figure not just accurately, but truthfully. Muscles flexing with intention, hands resting in natural poise, eyes turned with thought rather than blankness. But this ability came not only from talent, but from tireless study. And over time, sketching the outer form was not enough. He wanted to know why the body looked and moved the way it did. What hidden systems animated the flesh? In his 40s, and again more intensively in his 50s, Leonardo began conducting dissections, first of animals, horses, oxen, birds, and then, with growing frequency, of human corpses. He worked mostly at night, in the stillness of hospitals and monastic infirmaries, where permission could sometimes be quietly obtained. The bodies were often those of the poor, the unclaimed, the forgotten. And yet in Leonardo's eyes, they were sacred maps, each limb, each muscle, a revelation. He began carefully sketching his observations, not as grotesque curiosities, but as masterful, clean renderings that could rival any medical illustration even today. He drew the heart with its chambers and valves. He traced veins and arteries, studying their web through the arms and legs. He dissected the brain, the lungs, the stomach, taking nothing for granted, questioning everything. His notes are astonishing not only for their beauty, but for their insight. He was among the first to correctly describe the curvature of the spine, the function of certain muscles, and the position of the fetus in the womb. He observed that the heart was a muscle, a revolutionary statement at the time. He studied how the diaphragm rose and fell with breath. He noted how vocal cords vibrated, how the tongue shaped sound. And he did all of this not with the detached eye of a surgeon, but with the reverence of a poet. On one page he drew the heart in cross-section, delicately, meticulously, and beside it wrote, "The heart is a muscle more marvelous than any other in the body." He marveled at the human skeleton, seeing in it both the elegance of architecture and the resilience of nature. Bones, he observed, were like the framework of buildings. Muscles were ropes, tendons were pulleys. The body was a machine, but one made by nature, not man. And unlike any machine he had ever drawn, it moved with grace, with emotion. One of his most haunting drawings is of an old man dissected after death. Leonardo recorded that the man had lived over 100 years and had died gently, without agony. He took note of the organs, of their wear, of the quiet story told by a century of breath. His lines were clean, his writing almost meditative. There is no coldness in the drawing, only curiosity and a profound respect for life, even as it ends. But his most astonishing anatomical studies may have been those of the fetus in the womb. Using permissioned access to a pregnant cadaver, something rare and controversial even by Renaissance standards, Leonardo produced drawings that still stir awe. He sketched the fetus curled within the amniotic sac, suspended like a pearl in a shell. He drew the uterine wall, the umbilical cord, the shifting of organs to accommodate life. These were not clinical depictions. They were intimate, quiet, almost reverent. He wrote, "The baby in the womb is in repose. It floats in the liquid of life." Such insights, even today, seem remarkable, and yet Leonardo's notebooks were never published in his lifetime. His findings, ahead of his era by centuries, remained mostly unseen. Scattered in journals, written in reverse script, tucked between sketches of birds and machines, his anatomical studies lived in silence. The reasons were many. Some were practical. His work was too vast, too disorganized. He moved between subjects, never settling long enough to compile a definitive treatise. Others were social. The church viewed dissection with suspicion. Though Leonardo was not persecuted, he knew well the boundaries he walked, and still others were internal. Perhaps he felt his work was always incomplete, always evolving. But for those who would later find his pages buried in collections auctioned across Europe, the revelation was breathtaking. Leonardo had not only drawn the body, he had understood it. His drawings of joints, of limbs in motion, of hands, oh the hands, were so detailed that later surgeons used them for study, not just to see the structure, but to feel it. Every knuckle, every tendon rendered with love. And still, even as he studied sinew and bone, Leonardo never lost sight of the soul. He believed the body was not merely flesh. It was the house of thought, of passion, of memory. His dissections were never desecrations. They were devotions. attempts to trace the shape of spirit in the scaffolding of form. He once wrote, "Nature is full of infinite causes that have never occurred in experience." In every incision, he sought not only the function, but the poetry behind it. And perhaps that is why, when you look at his anatomical sketches today, they do not feel cold. They feel alive, still beating, still wondering. So tonight, imagine him in that stone room lit by candlelight, a silver scalpel resting beside parchment, the silence deep, the only sound, the scratch of a quill as he draws not just what he sees, but what he feels beneath the skin. And as you sleep, let the lines of Leonardo's sketches drift through your dreams. For in every tendon, in every rib, he was not just mapping the body, he was searching for the soul. The soul, for Leonardo, was never a thing to be named directly. It was not some separate entity locked inside the body. It was woven through it, in breath and movement, in thought and sensation. He sensed it in the flicker of an eyelid, the tension in a hand about to gesture, the whisper between a smile and silence. And nowhere did he pursue that ghost more intimately than in the human face. To draw a face, in Leonardo's eyes, was not simply to copy. It was to understand expression, mood, and the infinitely subtle dances of light and shadow. A cheek was not just a curve, it was a geography of tenderness and time. A brow could speak before the mouth did. The eye, that delicate orb of light and reflection, was a gateway, not just into the body, but out from it. He studied faces everywhere, on the street, in the marketplace, at court, among labourers and nobles, children and the old. He drew them from memory and from life. Often, his pages are filled with rows of heads, grotesque, beautiful, serene, contorted in laughter, furrowed in rage. He was fascinated by extremes of expression, yes, but also by the quiet neutrality that lies between that calm, unreadable face that seems to hover between thought and dream. He used to follow strangers just to watch how their features changed when they believed themselves unobserved. One story tells of Leonardo watching a man in the street, memorizing his face so intensely that he returned to the studio and recreated it in full from memory. Not just the bones, but the life. In many of his portraits, even the unfinished ones, you can see this devotion to inner world. The subjects are not stiff or posed. They breathe. The corners of their mouths hint at feeling. Their gazes connect not only with the viewer, but with something distant and inward. They seem to live within the moment and beyond it. This, perhaps, is why his portraits still hold us, centuries later, in a strange kind of intimacy. Leonardo often spoke of moti dell'anima, the movements of the soul. He believed that the face, and particularly the eyes and mouth, revealed the tides of emotion beneath. In his notebooks he wrote, "The soul that can speak with the eyes can also kiss with a gaze." And when he painted, he did not simply shape faces, he listened to them. He watched, he waited. He let them arrive on the panel in whispers, not in declarations. Take The Lady with an Ermine, a portrait of Cecilia Gallerani, the young mistress of Ludovico Sforza. She sits, turned in profile, one hand gently cradling a small white ermine. Her expression is not smiling, but knowing. The ermine, a symbol of purity and also a pun on her lover's name, glows against the dark background. The folds of her sleeve, the turn of her fingers, the texture of the fur, all rendered with precise softness. But it's her eyes that arrest you. They're looking past the viewer as though she's just heard something from another room. She's half in the moment, half beyond it. It's not just her likeness Leonardo captured, it's her attention, her presence. In another drawing, he sketched heads of grotesques, exaggerated caricatures with bulging noses, wide mouths, twisted expressions. They weren't meant to ridicule, but to study. He saw all faces as worthy of inquiry, beautiful or strange, noble or crude. They were all instruments of feeling, of narrative. Even when he didn't finish a portrait, he often left behind preparatory studies, delicate silver point drawings or chalk sketches, showing his exploration of subtle variation. A hand held a different way, an eye cast slightly downward, the moment before a breath, not after. And of course there is her, the Mona Lisa. By now, Leonardo had long passed the age of mere commissions. He painted Lisa Gherardini not as a client, but as a meditation. The portrait remained with him through the years, always in process, never surrendered. It was a face he returned to endlessly, to adjust the shadow of a cheek, the texture of skin, the curve of her smile. He studied her like a musician returns to a favorite melody, finding new phrasing each time, hearing silence between the notes. Her smile, that eternal, elusive smile, has confounded centuries. Is it happy, sad, tender, mocking? She contains contradiction, and perhaps that was Leonardo's secret. He painted her not with certainty, but with possibility. He didn't want to pin her down. He wanted her to remain open, like life itself. The background behind her shifts impossibly, one side lower than the other, a subtle, dreamy distortion. Rivers curve toward vanishing points, mountains rise in bluish haze. The landscape is unreal. Or rather, it's what the soul might see when memory turns into dream. Leonardo once wrote that a painting is a thing made of spirit and hand. In the Mona Lisa, that spirit flows without interruption from the eye, through the mind, to the brush. She is not just a woman. She is a threshold between emotion and stillness, between the known and the unknowable. And so in his study of faces, Leonardo did not merely create portraits. He created encounters. He invited us to look, and then subtly to feel ourselves being looked at, to become aware of our own expressions, our own thoughts, as we peer into another's. This, perhaps, is the quiet magic of his work. Not spectacle, not decoration, but intimacy. So tonight, close your eyes and imagine the candlelight flickering on the surface of a canvas. The slow, deliberate movement of a brush touching skin, not as colour, but as breath. A face emerging not from paint, but from silence. And a man watching that face, not to capture it, but to understand it. For in every eyelid, every wrinkle, every glance, Leonardo searched not for beauty alone, but for the soul in motion. The soul, for Leonardo, was not just hidden in faces and gestures, it flowed through everything. Through nature, through animals, through the endless patterns of the earth. He saw no boundary between man and environment. To him, the human body, the river, the tree, the cloud, all belonged to a single divine mechanism, a system of elegant repetitions, of spirals and flows, of cause and consequence. And so, long before the word ecology existed, Leonardo da Vinci became one of its earliest and most instinctive students. He believed that to truly know the world, one had to walk through it, to feel it beneath one's feet, to watch how light filtered through the canopy of trees, how water fell against rock, how birds glided on thermals invisible to the eye. He was not content to paint nature from memory. He had to listen to it, to sit in silence and observe without judgment. His notebooks overflowed with natural studies, the spiral of a shell, the curling of a leaf as it withered, the branching of trees, and how they divided with mathematical grace. He noticed that a tree's trunk would split into limbs whose total cross-section always equaled the size of the trunk, a pattern so consistent it whispered of deeper design. To Leonardo, this was no accident. It was law. Beauty, he thought, was the result of hidden structure, a kind of geometry beneath appearances. And so he studied not just how things looked, but how they grew, how they changed, how they aged. He wrote of rocks and minerals, of fossils found high in the mountains, which he correctly guessed had once been seabeds. He rejected the common explanation that the Great Flood had placed them there. Instead, he proposed a world in motion, a world that had risen and shifted and breathed over eons. He believed that the earth, like the human body, had circulation, that water carved paths like blood through veins. He wrote, "We may say that the earth has a vegetative soul, and that its flesh is the soil, its bones are the arrangements of the rocks, its breathing and the expansion and contraction of its waters." Such thoughts were not merely poetic, they were revolutionary. At a time when most saw nature as a backdrop or a resource, Leonardo saw it as alive, not human, but sacred, structured, mysterious. It's why, even in his art, landscapes were never just backgrounds. They were active forces. In the Virgin of the Rocks, the caves and rivers are not just setting, they are presence. In the Mona Lisa, the strange landscape behind her mirrors her own enigmatic interior. Leonardo's figures and their environments often echo each other, both shaped by curves, both softened by light. He studied water with a kind of reverence, how it eddied, how it spun in whirlpools, how it reflected and refracted light. He watched rain fall into puddles and noted how the ripples expanded, intersected, cancelled and amplified one another. He made hundreds of drawings, waves crashing, rivers splitting, droplets falling. He imagined water not as chaos, but as rhythm. He even thought of creating a book entirely about it, on the nature of water, though, like many of his dreams, it was never completed. In one page of his notebook, he wrote simply, "Water is the driver of nature." He also studied the wind, how it pushed clouds, bent trees, carried seeds. He watched birds in flight and considered how air flowed over their wings. He didn't have the vocabulary of aerodynamics, but he felt its truths. He tried to replicate nature's patterns in his inventions, his flying machines shaped like birds, his parachutes like seeds. And as always, he found his way back to the spiral. The spiral, that graceful, endless curve, appears in dozens of Leonardo's drawings. In the coils of shells, the curl of hair, the swirl of water and flame. He once filled an entire page with spiraling forms, as though trying to understand a motion that seemed both natural and eternal. He saw in it the key to growth, to time, to energy, not a symbol, a structure. And in the spiral, perhaps, he saw himself, always returning, always revisiting, never quite repeating. Even animals did not escape his curiosity. He sketched the limbs of lions, the wings of bats, the eyes of cats. He marveled at the mechanics of flight, of gallop, of predation. He respected animals deeply. He was known to buy birds in cages at the market, only to set them free, quietly, without spectacle. He viewed them not as lesser beings, but as fellow parts of the great engine of life. Vegetation, too, drew his gaze. He noted how sunflowers turned to follow the sun, how vines curled around branches, how roots spread beneath the earth in mirror of what was above. He studied the leaf arrangements of plants, the way they captured light, the geometry of their growth. It was as if every petal, every seed, every blade of grass spoke a language he longed to learn. But he did not study nature to conquer it. He studied it to belong to it. He believed that man was not above nature, but within it. That understanding the world meant respecting its order, even its mystery. He rejected simple answers. He distrusted those who claimed to know too much. He once said, "Nature is full of infinite causes that have never occurred in experience." To walk with Leonardo through a forest would have been a lesson in wonder. He would have pointed out the fluttering of leaves, not just as beauty, but as physics. He would have watched ants carry crumbs and considered the architecture of effort. He would have paused at the edge of a stream and, in silence, traced its lines with his eyes, already seeing the invisible patterns beneath. And so, tonight, imagine him walking, slowly, deliberately, through a grove at dusk. The light is golden, warm against the bark. A bird calls once, then again. Leonardo stops, kneels beside a plant whose name he doesn't know, and smiles. Not because he has found an answer, but because he has found a question worth loving. For in every leaf, every ripple, every gust of wind, he saw not just nature, but the handwriting of something larger. Something that spoke without words, painted without hands, and composed the world not in silence, but in rhythm. By the time Leonardo da Vinci reached the later decades of his life, he had become a cartographer of the invisible. His mind no longer sought merely to portray the outward beauty of the world, but to uncover its inner frameworks, the logic behind the curve of a river, the breath within a building, the silence between stars. And among all the disciplines he touched, art, anatomy, mechanics, nature, there was one more realm where his imagination wandered restlessly. Architecture. Leonardo never built a cathedral. He never completed a fortress or oversaw the construction of a city from blueprint to reality. And yet his notebooks are filled with domes, towers, bridges, ideal towns, symmetrical plans and utopian visions. He was not an architect in stone, but an architect in thought, and that in his time was perhaps more dangerous and more daring. His earliest architectural studies were grounded in the geometry he absorbed from earlier Renaissance thinkers, men like Brunelleschi and Alberti, who had begun the long revival of Roman proportion and mathematical elegance in space. But Leonardo did not merely repeat their principles. He played with them. He unraveled the ratios, twisted the symmetry, explored how light and air shaped not just buildings, but the humans within them. He believed that architecture was not just about shelter or function, but about experience, about how it felt to move through a space, how the eye was drawn upward or inward, how harmony could be sensed long before it was measured. In his vision, a building was a living organism. Its walls breathed, its windows saw, its corridors flowed like veins, carrying light and people through like blood in a body. one of his most ambitious and unfinished ideas was the design of an ideal city. This wasn't just a dream of beauty. It was born out of fear and frustration. During Leonardo's years in Milan, the city had suffered repeated outbreaks of plague. He had witnessed firsthand the chaos of overcrowded streets, stagnant canals, and poor sanitation. He believed that disease was not merely a matter of fate, but of design. And so he began to sketch a city that could breathe. His città ideale, the ideal city, was layered like a living thing. The lower levels would carry waste and water, hidden from view, efficiently channeled. Above, wide streets would allow airflow, with organized zones for commerce, residence, and worship. He proposed using canals not just for irrigation or travel, but for cleansing, the washing of streets and the movement of refuse away from population centers. Buildings would be modular, elegant, spaced for light and silence. He drew cross-sections, elevations, detailed renderings of staircases, arches, courtyards. Nothing was arbitrary. Every angle, every ratio was measured with a sense of grace. It was a city that served its people without oppressing them, a city that uplifted. But no one built it. The resources were not there. The vision was too far ahead. And yet these drawings survived. Quietly, they waited. And centuries later, urban planners would look back at those pages and recognize something astonishing. Leonardo had anticipated many principles of modern city planning: sanitation, zoning, public health, access to green space, and even more than that, he had seen something we still struggle to remember, that cities are not machines to dominate nature, but expressions of our relationship to it. Architecture for Leonardo extended to every form. He designed bridges, some temporary and fastened by ropes, others permanent and curved in elegant arches. He imagined mobile bridges that could be pulled across rivers during military campaigns, folding and unfolding like wings. These, too, were never built. But centuries later, engineers found his bridge designs structurally sound, even brilliant. He also turned his eye to military architecture, not from a love of war, but from the intellectual challenge it posed. He studied fortresses, imagining walls angled to deflect cannon fire, moats fed by redirected streams, entryways hidden in spirals or dead ends to confuse attackers. His understanding of geometry made him particularly adept at envisioning fortifications that were defensive and intimidating, fortresses that were not merely walls but psychological weapons. And yet, even when he designed instruments of war, there was something artistic about them: the balance, the curve, the care in each joint. It was as if he could not help but make beauty, even in the machinery of destruction. But perhaps the most poetic example of his architectural thinking lies not in grand city plans or military blueprints, but in his drawings of staircases. Yes, staircases. He loved them. He drew them in spirals and double helices, twisting inward like shells, outward like galaxies. He imagined double staircases where two people could ascend and descend simultaneously without ever crossing paths. For Leonardo, the staircase was not just a connection between floors. It was a metaphor, a bridge between levels, between states, between earth and sky. In this, perhaps, we glimpse something essential about Leonardo. He always saw the in-between. He saw the bridge between science and art, between logic and emotion, between the material and the spiritual. He was never content with a single layer. He wanted to peel back, to dive deeper, to walk the hidden corridor behind the obvious door. He once wrote, "Let no one read me who is not a mathematician." But he also wrote of love, of wonder, of the music of movement. He believed architecture was not just a science, but a choreography, and the human body its most faithful dancer. And so tonight, as you drift further into stillness, picture Leonardo leaning over a large sheet of parchment, drawing the arch of a window that curves just enough to catch morning light. Imagine him testing the steps of a spiral stair, one foot placed gently on an imagined rung, smiling at how the space unfolds. He never saw his cities rise, his bridges were never crossed, his buildings never built, but they live in the mind. And maybe that's enough. For in every line he drew, whether of domes or doorways, Leonardo wasn't just imagining stone, he was building a future in which space could reflect the soul. In the great architecture of Leonardo's mind, music held its own vaulted chamber. Though we most often remember him as the painter, the inventor, the dissector of forms and seeker of light, Leonardo da Vinci was also a musician. one of uncommon sensitivity, natural talent, and quiet mastery. And like everything he touched, he approached music not only with skill, but with wonder. To Leonardo, music was not merely entertainment. It was mathematics made audible. Motion translated into emotion. Proportion rendered in sound. He once wrote, "Music is the shaping of the invisible." And in his world, where birds flew on blueprints, cities rose from sketches, and hearts were measured like engines, music was the thread that tied the ethereal to the physical. From an early age, Leonardo showed an instinct for melody. It is said that he could sing with a voice full of clarity and warmth, and that he played the lyre with extraordinary grace. The lyre, a delicate stringed instrument descended from ancient times, became his companion. He crafted one himself, fashioned in part from silver and shaped in the likeness of a horse's head. It was not merely functional. It was sculpture, art and utility once again intertwined. When Leonardo moved to Milan to serve at the court of Ludovico Sforza, one of the reasons for his welcome was this musical talent. Stories suggest he could improvise verses and melodies on the spot, delighting courtiers and nobles alike. Yet his music was never loud with vanity. It was subtle, reflective, often melancholic, like a thought that cannot be spoken, only hummed. Though few compositions of his have survived, and some argue whether any have, his notebooks are filled with clues. He wrote about harmony and rhythm, about the acoustics of halls, about the resonance of strings and air. He explored how sound travelled, how it bounced and folded and faded. He studied how the shape of an instrument's body affected tone, and how certain rooms could be designed to catch echoes like hands catching falling rain. He even designed mechanical instruments, strange hybrids of imagination and craftsmanship. One was an organ powered not by air but by water. Another, a viola organista, combined the keyboard of a harpsichord with the sound of bowed strings, centuries ahead of its time. Though never built in his lifetime, this invention would later be constructed by a modern craftsman using his notes, and it sang with a voice that seemed born from another world. What fascinated Leonardo most about music was its transience. Unlike painting, which could endure, or sculpture which stood in stone, music existed only in the moment. It rose, it moved, it vanished. He once called it a ghost of air. And yet, despite its impermanence, music had the power to stir emotions more deeply than any image. He wrote of how harmonies could influence mood, how minor tones conjured sadness, how intervals could create tension or release. He observed how certain sounds reminded people of wind or water or voices long lost. He believed that music could speak where words failed, that in melody one could find the shape of grief or joy or longing. Perhaps that's why, even in his most scientific writings, metaphors of sound appear again and again. He described the waves of water as vibrations. He saw the flutter of a bird's wing as rhythm. He imagined the heartbeat as a kind of percussion, life's first and final instrument. He even wrote about the voice, the human voice, as the most perfect of all instruments. He studied how air passed through the throat, how the tongue and lips shaped syllables. He sketched the larynx, the resonant chambers of the skull. For Leonardo, to understand the voice was to understand not just sound, but identity. The voice was personal, unique, a signature of the soul. In his notes on harmony, he used mathematical ratios to explore consonance and dissonance, echoing the work of Pythagoras, who believed that all of nature vibrated with hidden music. Leonardo seemed to agree. He often drew parallels between the orbits of planets and the movement of melodies, between the spacing of leaves on a stem and the intervals of a scale. To him, the universe itself was a kind of fugue. And still, he never made a spectacle of his musicianship. He did not seek fame as a composer. He did not publish treatises on music theory. He played because it pleased him, because it soothed the restlessness of a mind always spinning. Because sometimes when the hands grew tired of drawing and the eyes burned from reading, the fingers could still find solace on strings. One can imagine him, alone in the corner of a quiet room at Clos-Lucé, his silver lyre resting on his knee, eyes closed as he coaxed a melody into being. Not grand, not loud, just a few notes echoing gently in the wooden rafters like the hush of wind through a high window. Music for Leonardo was a bridge between the seen and the unseen, between logic and feeling. It was the thread that tied architecture to anatomy, invention to intimacy. It needed no audience, only presence. And so tonight, imagine the stillness of a candlelit room and an old man, back slightly bent, hair silvered with age, coaxing music from strings. The melody is slow, wandering. It does not seek an end. It only seeks to be. And in that moment, with the air trembling gently around him, Leonardo is not solving, not building, not painting. He is simply listening to the shape of the invisible. In the quiet corridors of Leonardo's later life, amid sketches of inventions and soft music played on silver strings, there lived something else. Something less spoken of, something private, but no less present. His relationships. Not the kind forged for diplomacy, nor the patronage of dukes and kings, but the quieter bonds, friendships, companionships, attachments that lasted through years of wandering and silence. These were not always loud or declared, but they were etched, like everything else, in the margins of his life. Leonardo never married. He fathered no known children. He wrote of no grand romances in his journals, made no public declarations of love. But the absence of formal family does not mean he lived without affection. Quite the opposite. His life was quietly populated by a few figures who followed him, cared for him, irritated him, and stood by him when the lights of courtly favour had long since dimmed. One of the most enduring of these relationships was with a boy named Gian Giacomo Caprotti, known to history by the name Leonardo gave him, Salai. The nickname in Lombard dialect meant little devil, and it was not given lightly. Salai entered Leonardo's household around 1490, when he was just 10 years old. He was unruly, impulsive, vain and beautiful. In the early notebooks, Leonardo scolds him for stealing money, lying and being lazy. But he never sent him away. Year after year, Salai remained. He became a fixture of Leonardo's studio, sometimes a model, sometimes an assistant, sometimes a source of chaos. He posed for angels, for mythic figures, for half-finished works that never left the room. He may have been the face behind Leonardo's drawings of Bacchus, or the soft, feminine forms in his androgynous sketches, but beyond the art there was a thread of attachment, strange perhaps, but undeniably strong. Was it love, friendship, tolerance born of habit? The records do not say. But they show us this. Salai remained with Leonardo for over 25 years. No one stays that long without meaning something. And then, later in life, another figure appeared, Francesco Melzi. Unlike Salai, Francesco came from nobility. He was refined, educated, thoughtful, the quiet counterweight to Salai's mercurial energy. He met Leonardo when he was just a teenager, sometime during the final Milanese period. And where others saw an old man past his prime, Francesco saw something else, a teacher, a guide, perhaps even a kind of father. Leonardo grew deeply attached to him. Francesco became not only a pupil, but a companion. He helped organize the notebooks, transcribe ideas, prepare materials, manage correspondence. In return, Leonardo shared everything, his philosophy, his methods, his worldview. There was tenderness in their dynamic, though unspoken. In the will Leonardo drafted shortly before his death, he left most of his belongings, including his manuscripts, instruments and paintings, to Francesco. That, more than any letter, reveals the depth of their bond. Between Salai and Melzi, Leonardo seemed to embody two sides of his own nature, one chaotic and impulsive, the other calm and deliberate. And perhaps it was in the balancing of these personalities that he found his quietest form of family. He also had friendships across Italy, with thinkers, artists, scholars. He admired Luca Pacioli, the mathematician with whom he studied geometric forms and wrote about proportion. They shared a fascination with the mystical side of numbers, the golden ratio, the platonic solids, the harmony hidden within symmetry. Their friendship, recorded in correspondence and collaborative work, was a meeting of minds, rigorous and playful at once. He met Niccolò Machiavelli in Florence, the sharp political theorist whose name would later become synonymous with cunning. Though their personalities differed greatly, they found common ground in discussions of strategy, nature, and the forces that governed human behavior. He exchanged letters with princes, scholars, and engineers. Some formal, others warm. But always in his own quiet way, he connected. Yet Leonardo was not a man of large crowds. He preferred solitude or the company of just one or two. In gatherings, he was known to be charming but reserved. Observant, gentle in voice, deliberate in gesture. When he spoke, people listened. but often he did not speak. He watched. Animals, too, seemed drawn to him. Birds, cats, even lizards. There are stories of Leonardo taming creatures others found wild. He would sketch them, hold them, feed them, set them free. In these small wordless exchanges, one senses a gentleness, a reverence for the soft connections between lives. And in his writing, every so often, something blooms, a line, a phrase that feels personal, that peaks beyond the invention and theory. In one note, he describes a man standing at a window looking at the moon. It's not part of a study, it's just an image, a mood, a moment remembered. In another, he writes, "While I thought I was learning how to live, I have been learning how to die." He was not lonely, but he lived alone in many ways, in thought, in method, in the vast cathedral of his mind. Those who came close to him glimpsed wonders, but few entered fully. Still, when the end came, it is said he was not alone. Francesco Melzi was there. Salai, perhaps, too. The King of France may have visited, may have held his hand. The details blur into legend, but the feeling remains. Leonardo, who had spent a lifetime observing, measuring, imagining, was, in the end, seen. And tonight, as you drift deeper into stillness, imagine him walking with Melzi in the gardens of Clos Lucé. The sun low, birds in the hedges, no words spoken, just footsteps and the hush of wind. And in that silence a bond, not of blood or vow, but of attention, of shared wonder. For in the soft spaces between people, in the glances, the silences, the loyal presences, Leonardo da Vinci found something more lasting than fame. He found connection. As Leonardo aged, his world began to slow. Not the one outside. The world of courts and crowns and commissions still whirled on, changing faces and flags with the usual restless rhythm. But within the walls of Clos Lucé, nestled in the Loire Valley's soft greens and winding river paths, time moved differently. Here, Leonardo's thoughts turned inward, not toward creation alone, but toward reflection. He had drawn nearly everything, the bones beneath the skin, the spirals of storms, the flight paths of birds. Now, in the final chapters of his life, he turned to something far less tangible. He turned to time itself. Leonardo had always measured things. He was obsessed with proportion, motion, sequence, the mathematics of beauty, the architecture of function. He had explored how the sun cast shadows at different hours, how tides followed the lunar pull, how aging etched itself into the face like water carving stone. He watched the movement of stars, tracked the tilt of leaves toward light, and noted how the body stiffened, then slackened with the passing years. But as his own days began to dwindle, Leonardo didn't write much about death. He observed it, certainly, through the bodies he had dissected, through the old man whose gentle passing he recorded, through the battles and plagues he had witnessed. Yet his notebooks rarely spoke of fear. There was no dread, no urgency. Instead, there was a kind of quiet acceptance, a recognition that everything, even genius, returns to stillness. He once wrote, "As a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so a life well used brings happy death." A single line, simple and profound. And in many ways it was the summation of his philosophy, not just of endings, but of meaning. He had not achieved all he dreamed. The giant horse remained uncast. Many of his machines were never built. His treatises on flight, water, anatomy, and painting all lay unfinished. But Leonardo never measured his life by what was completed. He measured it by the depth of curiosity pursued, the questions asked, the quiet reverence with which he observed the world. In his final years, surrounded by Melzi and the servants granted to him by the King of France, Leonardo continued to write, but the tone shifted. The frantic energy of earlier years softened. His lines became less rigid, more meditative. He wrote about the motion of water and the persistence of air. He wrote about how a drop of ink spread on parchment, not in terms of pigment and absorbency alone, but as a metaphor for diffusion, for presence slipping outward. He returned again and again to the image of circles. The circle had always fascinated him, the perfect form, the infinite loop, the shape with no beginning or end. He saw it in the iris of an eye, the orbit of planets, the halls of fingerprints. In one sketch, he drew a man with arms and legs extended inside both a circle and a square, the Vitruvian man, a study in ideal proportion, yes, but also a meditation on balance. What is man, he asked, but a reflection of the world? What is the world but a mirror of man? He wrote about light, too, always light, how it entered a room, how it softened the corners of objects, how it made stone glow like skin. He had spent a lifetime chasing the perfect way to paint it, to suggest its warmth without overwhelming form. And in his notes, he still chased it, not with paintbrushes, but with words. "Shadow is the privation of light," he wrote. "Darkness is absence. Light is presence." These weren't just technical musings, they were spiritual in their way. Leonardo was not a devout man by the standards of his age. He did not loudly proclaim faith, nor devote much time to theological debate, but he was never without reverence. He saw design in nature, purpose in chaos, harmony in apparent randomness. If he prayed, it was not with folded hands, but with open eyes. One day in his final months, he noted that he felt his time drawing short. He began to make arrangements. He dictated his will. He thanked his companions. He organized his notebooks or asked Melzi to. He left instructions, not for monuments, but for care. Care of his work, care of his animals, care of the people who had helped him. He was not interested in legacy in the way kings were. He seemed to know that what mattered could not be held in a statue or a title. His hands, once so steady, had begun to tremble. He painted little now, perhaps not at all. But in those final days, he continued to observe. Out his window, the river still flowed. Birds still moved from branch to branch. Light still pooled on the stone floor in the mornings, then receded as the sun tilted west. The world always in motion. Even as he slowed, and when the end came, as it comes to all, it came not with thunder, but with hush. There is a story, told often and softened with time, that King Francis I cradled Leonardo's head as he died, that the great master passed not in solitude, but in the arms of admiration. We cannot say if it's true, but we can say this: he was not forgotten, not then, not now. Leonardo died on May 2nd, 1519, but he did not vanish. He remains in the smile that draws you closer the longer you look. In the flight of machines that trace the sky with silent wings, in the soft blending of shadow across a painted cheek, in the pages where circles spiral into thought. And tonight, as your breath slows and your eyes begin to close, imagine him in his final hour, not afraid, not sad, but at peace. A candle flickers, the pages lie open. Outside the river sings, and Leonardo da Vinci, having spent his life drawing the world, finally lets it draw him back, gently, slowly, completely, into the curve of time. Long after Leonardo's hand had stilled, his notebooks remained, scattered, silent and mysterious. They did not sit upon golden shelves in palaces or beneath cathedral domes, honoured and protected. Instead, they lay folded in drawers, passed between collectors, bundled in trunks, their pages darkened with oil and age. They were not trophies, they were puzzles. And for centuries, the world did not fully understand what it had. These notebooks, often called codices, were not arranged in sequence or theme. Leonardo wrote where the ink fell, on scraps of paper, in margins, on the backs of receipts, on loose parchment and folded vellum. He wrote from right to left, in mirror script, as if hiding his thoughts from casual readers, or simply because it was easier for his left hand to push than to pull. The pages teem with sketches and riddles, engineering diagrams next to studies of hands, botanical drawings beside notes on eclipses. They are, in every sense, maps of a restless mind. Leonardo left most of them to Francesco Melzi, his devoted pupil, who cherished them and tried to preserve their order. But after Melzi's death, they passed into the hands of others, some careful, some careless. Pages were removed, volumes separated. Some were sold to aristocrats, some lost in private libraries. One codex was found centuries later in a chest used as a sewing box. Another surfaced in a drawer in Madrid. The dispersal was slow and strange, like seeds blown into the wind. But the wonder remained. In these notebooks, we see not only the Leonardo, but the texture of his mind. He was not linear. He was not methodical in the conventional sense. He looped, circled, returned. One page might contain a study of how birds fold their wings mid-flight, a sketch of a siege weapon, and a grocery list with eggs, wine, ink scribbled in the corner. The next might be a complex anatomical rendering with a caption that simply says, "Observe." And yet amidst this chaos there is clarity, not of answer, but of intent. Leonardo didn't write to impress others, he wrote to understand, to wrestle with questions until they surrendered shape, to freeze thought in ink long enough to study it. These notebooks were not finished works. They were living laboratories, ongoing conversations with the self. One of the largest surviving collections is the Codex Atlanticus, over 1,000 pages of drawings and notes spanning more than 40 years. In it you'll find designs for water-lifting devices, descriptions of natural disasters, plans for a mechanical lion that could walk and open its chest to reveal lilies. There are letters to patrons and sketches of musical instruments. Every page is a universe. Then there is the Codex Leicester, a slim but dense volume of scientific observations, including his theories on hydrodynamics, fossils, and lunar reflection. In it, Leonardo proposes that the moon shines not by its own light, but by the reflection of the Earth's light, a theory that, though initially overlooked, proved astonishingly accurate. That particular codex passed through many hands, eventually acquired by the Earl of Leicester, hence the name, and centuries later, purchased by none other than Bill Gates, who made its contents widely available, helping usher Leonardo's work into the digital age. But even with these revelations, many of Leonardo's pages remain unread, untranslated, or underappreciated. Not because they are hidden, but because they demand patience. They are not books in the modern sense. They are riddles. They ask you not just to look, but to linger, to wonder, to turn the page and find yourself in an entirely different world. And isn't that what Leonardo always invited us to do? To not merely observe, but to question. To follow the arc of a falling leaf, not as a metaphor, but as a mechanism. To look at a mountain not as mass, but as history, compressed time. To see the human hand not as a tool, but as an orchestra of motion and intention. There is a page, quiet, almost overlooked, where Leonardo writes, "The eye, which is called the window of the soul, is the chief means whereby the understanding may most fully and abundantly appreciate the infinite works of nature. It is not a proclamation. It is a whisper, a reminder." The notebooks are filled with such whispers, some incomplete, some contradictory, all human. For Leonardo was not a prophet, he was not infallible, he made mistakes, he miscalculated, he abandoned projects, he questioned himself constantly. But in doing so, he left behind something far more valuable than perfect answers. He left behind the practice of wondering. And that is perhaps why centuries later, his notebooks still draw people in, not just scholars and artists, but dreamers. They do not offer conclusions, they offer openings. They remind us that genius is not a flame that bursts suddenly into being, but a slow, steady burning, a willingness to look again, and again, and again. So tonight, picture one of those notebooks resting on a wooden desk. A candle flickers, the ink still glistens faintly in the light, a hand turns a page slowly. There are smudges where a thumb pressed too long, a faint sketch of a bird in motion, a note beside it. Why does it not fall? No answer, just the question, still waiting. Still alive. By the time the Renaissance world fully awoke to what Leonardo had left behind, centuries had already passed. The master's paintings had survived in museums and cathedrals, his name whispered with reverence, even awe. Yet the man himself, the full shape of his mind, his doubts, his private fascinations, had long remained obscured beneath layers of legend and fragmented memory. His notebooks had only begun to be read, his drawings puzzled over, his engineering dreams dusted off and reconsidered. It was as if time had buried him gently under its soft, slow sands, and then centuries later began to brush them away, page by delicate page. But not everything was preserved. Leonardo da Vinci's legacy is immense, yes, but incomplete. Of the many thousands of pages he is believed to have filled in his lifetime, only a portion remains. Many were lost to war, to fire, to neglect. Some may yet sit undiscovered in trunks in forgotten attics, in the backs of ancient archives, misfiled or mislabeled. Others were torn, sold, stolen, or simply left behind. And so as we trace his life, we must also learn to trace the spaces between, the absences, the unfinished paintings, the inventions only partially explained, the thoughts left mid-sentence. One of the greatest tragedies of Leonardo's artistic legacy is the number of works left incomplete. He began many commissions with enthusiasm, often pouring weeks or months into preparatory studies, sketches, and experiments, only to grow restless before the final brushstroke. He would circle an idea endlessly, like a hawk tracing spirals over a field, but often fly on before it was caught. The Adoration of the Magi, commissioned by the Augustinian monks of San Donato in Florence, is a haunting example. He painted it in 1481, but left it unfinished after only a year. The composition is chaotic and brilliant. Mary and the infant Christ centered, surrounded by a whirl of figures, twisted columns, architectural fragments. The background is raw and ghostly, as if the story had erupted from dream. And perhaps that was the problem. It was a dream. Too vast, too layered. He abandoned it. Yet even in its rawness, it is astonishing. Then there was the Battle of Anghiari, begun in Florence as part of a grand commission for the Palazzo Vecchio. It, too, was never completed. He experimented with a new wall painting technique, using oil paints on plaster, hoping for greater detail and depth. But the paint melted, dripped, peeled. Leonardo tried to fix it with fires lit the base of the wall to dry the surface. It failed. He walked away. All that remains are sketches and a few copies made by later artists, enough to suggest a painting so alive, so brutal in its realism, that it might have redefined Renaissance art had it been finished. And yet, he did not finish it. This pattern followed him. He would often become obsessed with one element, the anatomy of a hand, the way light passed through translucent skin, the twist of a horse's leg, and in chasing that detail, lose interest in the larger work. Some saw this as failure. But Leonardo saw the process itself as the purpose. The act of searching was the art. And still, he did complete some works, a few, just a few, that today are considered among the greatest in human history. But it's what we don't have that keeps us wondering. A lost painting of Leda and the Swan, described by his contemporaries as breathtaking, vanished into history. His detailed anatomical treatises, which could have revolutionized medicine centuries earlier, remained unpublished. His plans for mechanical devices, his vision of a better city, his thoughts on water and air, all scattered, fragmented. And yet, within this incompleteness lies his greatest gift. For Leonardo did not present the world with finished answers. He gave it questions, brilliant, uncomfortable, endless questions, wrapped in beauty and curiosity. He once wrote, "Art is never finished, only abandoned." Perhaps he believed that the true purpose of creation was not conclusion, but conversation. A painting should breathe beyond the artist. An idea should outlive its diagram. A thought, once spoken or sketched, should continue walking, through minds, through time, through new hands. Even the Mona Lisa, his most complete and famous work, he never delivered. He kept it with him for years, adjusting it, retouching, reworking the layers until the very end of his life. Some say it was never truly finished, that he painted it as a mirror, not of her but of himself. A study in patience and possibility. So many today chase perfection, but Leonardo reminds us that truth often lives in the unfinished, in the sketch, in the margin, in the draft whispered to oneself in a quiet room. Perhaps that's why his work still calls to us. It doesn't shut the door. It leaves it ajar. And in that open door, in that gentle pause between what is and what could be, we find not just art, but invitation. So tonight, picture an empty canvas in a quiet studio. The light is low. A brush rests on the edge of a jar. A figure is half-formed, just shadow and curve, hint and breath. It waits, not for completion, but for the next mind to look, to wonder, to begin. Because in Leonardo's world, beginning was everything. Ending was just one more question. Somewhere in the dim corridors of time, Leonardo's name began to lift again. Not in the way of heroes carved into monuments, but like a melody once heard and half remembered. Quietly, gradually, through the echoes of his work, his sketches, his unfinished thoughts. As Europe moved into new centuries, with new kings, new wars and new ideas, Leonardo's legacy shifted shape. He became, more and more, an enigma, a figure of wonder whose genius was undeniable, but whose totality remained just beyond reach. In the centuries immediately after his death, Leonardo was admired, but not fully understood. His paintings, especially the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, were recognized as masterpieces. Artists praised his technique. Some tried to emulate his style, but few grasped the full range of what he had done. His notebooks, for the most part, remained unpublished, hidden in private collections, passed hand to hand like secret maps written in a language no one fully read. The world, in many ways, was not yet ready. The 17th and 18th centuries were dominated by other kinds of brilliance, by mathematical rigor, empirical science, classical reason. Leonardo, with his swirling curiosity, his chaotic pages, his half-finished dreams, did not fit neatly into those frames. He was a puzzle, Too artistic to be claimed by the scientists, too scientific to be embraced fully by the artists, too broad for the narrow boxes that history tried to place around him. But then, slowly, the world began to change. In the 19th century, a new kind of mind began to emerge, one fascinated not just with results, but with imagination. The Romantics saw in Leonardo something they recognized, a soul that wandered, that wondered, that burned with longing for the infinite. Poets wrote of him, painters studied his forms not only for technique, but for the emotion behind the line. And scholars finally began to uncover more of his writings. Pages were translated, the mirror script deciphered, the strange interwoven drawings of birds, engines, hands and water began to reveal themselves not as madness, but as brilliance. The fragmented became a mosaic, and in that mosaic the world saw not just a man, but a mind, luminous, lonely, endlessly searching. In 1883, the first major facsimile edition of his notebooks was published. More followed in the 20th century. With each volume, Leonardo's genius grew clearer, not only to historians, but to scientists, engineers, designers, and dreamers. Suddenly, the man who had once been seen only as a painter of mysterious smiles became something more. The father of biomechanics, of flight theory, of modern anatomy and hydraulics. His ideas, once forgotten, were found to prefigure discoveries made centuries later. The Codex Atlanticus, the Codex Leicester, the Codex Arundel, these were no longer curiosities, they were revelations. And yet with this renewed attention came a new kind of myth-making. Leonardo was elevated, idealized. He became the archetype of the Renaissance man, the universal genius, master of all disciplines, flawless and untouchable. Books were written that called him superhuman. Films portrayed him as eccentric, aloof, all-knowing. Even cartoons invoked him, placing him alongside Einstein and Newton as icons of brilliance. But the real Leonardo was quieter than all that. He was not flawless. He was not always confident. He abandoned projects. He questioned his own abilities. He often doubted what others accepted without hesitation. He was playful, private, sometimes melancholic. He kept secrets. He left things undone. And this, too, is part of his legacy. For Leonardo's genius was not in how much he mastered, but in how deeply he remained a student. His notebooks are not declarations. They are explorations. Not textbooks, but journals. He was always beginning again, always learning, always trying to see more clearly. That humility, that open-eyed wonder is what makes his work so alive. Even now in the 21st century, Leonardo remains astonishingly relevant. His anatomical drawings continue to inform medical understanding. His designs for machines are studied in engineering schools. His ideas about city planning and environmental design have found new urgency in a world grappling with climate and chaos. And beyond the practical, he continues to inspire. Artists look to him for the grace in his line. Scientists admire his relentless questioning. Inventors marvel at how he combined observation with imagination. And ordinary people, the curious, the quiet, the wanderers, find in him a mirror, a reminder that it is okay not to finish, that it is noble to question, that it is beautiful to simply wonder. He is not remembered because he conquered the world. He is remembered because he never stopped looking at it with awe. And so Leonardo lives not only in the museums and manuscripts, but in the minds of those who pause, who peer, who lean just a little closer. Tonight, imagine one of those minds, a young artist or a scientist, or simply a student sitting at a desk, tracing their fingers across a page from one of Leonardo's notebooks. They do not understand all of it, but they understand enough to feel the spark, the question, the invitation across time. And across time, across silence, Leonardo da Vinci whispered not an answer, but a door, open, waiting. Somewhere in the centuries after Leonardo's death, a strange thing began to happen. He turned into a legend. Not just a revered artist, not merely a master of invention or anatomy, but something else entirely, a mythic figure whose very name seemed to shimmer with mystery. In time, his identity stretched far beyond the bounds of history and slipped quietly into imagination. Leonardo da Vinci was no longer just a man. He became a symbol, a question, a cipher in the tapestry of human genius. But how does a man become a myth? It starts with silence, with the spaces between facts, with the unanswered letters, the missing paintings, the torn pages of notebooks. When we cannot fully know someone, we begin to imagine them. and few figures in history left behind as much brilliance or as many gaps as Leonardo. People began to fill those gaps with stories, some based in truth, some softened by admiration, others spun from wonder, woven in the quiet corners of Europe's drawing rooms, libraries and lecture halls. They said he had invented everything. They said he knew how to fly. They said he was a magician, an alchemist, a prophet who spoke in codes. They said his paintings held secrets, not just of technique, but of religion, of politics, of love. Some whispered that the Mona Lisa was not a woman at all, but a self-portrait in disguise. Others claimed that within the folds of the Last Supper was a hidden message, a clue to forbidden knowledge or lost history. He became a figure of speculation, of novels and riddles. He was turned into puzzles, dramatized in movies, cast as a keeper of ancient truths. But the real Leonardo was none of these things, and yet he was also all of them. Because the truth about Leonardo da Vinci is that he resists containment. Every attempt to define him becomes itself a kind of mirror, reflecting more about the seeker than the subject. He lived at the intersection of art and science, of spirit and structure, of order and chaos. To know him completely would require stepping into the infinite loops of his own thoughts. And yet the beauty of Leonardo is that he invites us to try. He offers the incomplete, the fragmented, the unfinished. And in doing so, he draws us in, not to worship, but to participate, to think, to feel, to wonder with him, to ask the same questions, to draw our own spirals, to believe, as he did, that observation is the beginning of transformation. He once wrote, "Learning never exhausts the mind." And his own mind, even centuries later, continues to awaken others. But myths are not only born from mystery, they are sustained by longing. We need Leonardo not only because he was extraordinary, but because he reminds us of what might be possible when curiosity is stronger than fear, when failure is part of creation, when genius is not about certainty, but about remaining endlessly open. And so, in art schools, young painters still study his lines. In biology labs, his anatomical sketches still astonish. In engineering departments, his machines are still modelled, tested and marvelled at. His name appears in textbooks, on monuments, in science fiction, in children's books. He lives not in one version, but in many. Scientist, artist, dreamer, rebel, sage. And maybe that's the point. He cannot be pinned down. He defies summary. He is a painting never signed, a page left blank, a question written in mirror script. And yet beneath the myth, the image, the centuries of interpretation, there remains a man. A boy from Vinci who loved the way light danced on water, who chased dragonflies along riverbanks, who dissected lilies and stared at clouds for hours, who sketched hands until they felt like music, who walked through Florence and Milan and Amboise, never simply passing through, but always studying, always noticing, always feeling. And it is perhaps there, in those quiet, unrecorded moments, that we find the real Leonardo, not in the marvels he created, but in the gaze behind them. So tonight, as the world turns gently toward rest, let the myths fall away for a moment. Picture Leonardo not as a master, but as a man sitting alone at twilight. A scrap of paper in his hand, a candle flickering low. He dips his pen, pauses, looks out the window and begins to draw. In the gentle hush of twilight, as candlelight dances against stone walls and the quill hesitates above the page, we return again to Leonardo, not as the towering figure history holds aloft, but as a solitary mind in motion. For all his brilliance, for all the commissions and kings, Leonardo da Vinci spent much of his life in waiting. Waiting for inspiration, for the right light, for answers to impossible questions. And in those stretches of silence, he developed one of the rarest qualities in genius: patience. He knew how to linger. In a world that rushed toward completion, Leonardo often moved in the opposite direction. He slowed down. He stared longer. He revisited problems that others had already walked past. While many of his contemporaries painted rapidly to meet demand, Leonardo would sometimes spend hours watching how a single fold of fabric cast its shadow, or how the curve of a smile changed in different light. To the outside world, this might have looked like indecision, procrastination, delay. But inside Leonardo, it was something else, a refusal to let speed eclipse truth. A belief that the deeper nature of things revealed itself only with time, slowly, gently, like a shy bird stepping from cover. He once wrote, He who can go to the fountain does not go to the water jar. Why settle for second-hand knowledge when the source, nature itself, is right there? This was his method, to go directly to the fountain, to see with his own eyes, touch with his own hands. He distrusted hearsay, dogma, repetition. He wanted to know. And knowing, for Leonardo, wasn't simply acquiring facts, it was absorbing them until they became part of his gaze, his fingers, his breath. When he painted as if he had lived inside the subject. Take, for example, the folds of clothing in his paintings. Not mere decoration, but gravity-bound studies of fabric in motion. The way silk slides down a shoulder, how linen gathers at the bend of an elbow. He sketched these endlessly, not for style, but for understanding. He saw fabric the way he saw rivers or branches or muscles as part of the same flowing principle. And hands, how he studied hands. No two alike, no two at rest in the same way. A mother's hand wrapped around a child, a saint's fingers raised in blessing. A musician's palm, soft with anticipation. To Leonardo, the hand was not an accessory, it was a language, a voice that spoke without sound. He drew them over and over, trying to learn their grammar. The same patience shaped his understanding of light. He did not simply illuminate his subjects. He listened to how light behaved, how it curled around form, how it dissolved into shadow, how it revealed texture without declaring it. His technique of sfumato, the soft blending of tones without harsh lines, came from years of watching mist rise off water, of squinting into the golden haze of afternoon. He understood that light never arrives all at once. It whispers. And so too did Leonardo. He was never one to shout. He preferred questions to declarations. His voice, by most accounts, was gentle, his movements calm. He had presence, but not in the way of kings or generals. It came from focus. From the quiet authority of someone who sees deeply and chooses words carefully. His contemporaries often couldn't keep pace. They mistook his slowness for indecision. But Leonardo was not indecisive. He simply valued accuracy more than applause. This quality, this patience, extended to how he worked with others too. He taught slowly, guiding his students with tenderness, never scolding. He didn't hoard knowledge. He shared it, in fragments, in sketches, in the way a master shows not just what to do, but why. And when faced with failure, he rarely showed anger. When the bronze for the great Sforza horse was diverted to make cannons, he didn't protest. When his frescoes began to flake, he didn't despair. He simply turned to the next page, began again. This, perhaps more than anything, reveals the heart of Leonardo, a man not crushed by imperfection, but sustained by pursuit. He knew, as few do, that mastery is not the goal. Curiosity is. That life is not about completing everything. It is about beginning again and again with wonder. So tonight, as the light fades and you begin to close your eyes, think not of the statues or the fame or the unfinished machines. Think of a man sitting quietly in his studio, watching how sunlight passes through a glass of water. Think of his pencil moving slowly across the page, tracing the outline of a leaf. Not to own it, but to know it. Think of the time he gave to silence, the grace he gave to mystery. For in every pause, in every waiting hour, Leonardo da Vinci was not losing time. He was learning how to see. There was something else Leonardo da Vinci carried with him, not in his satchels of sketches or the pages of coded script, but deeper, quieter. A kind of restlessness. A gentle ache that no amount of painting or inventing could quite satisfy. It wasn't sadness, exactly. It was more like yearning, a longing for something he could sense, but never fully reach. Leonardo lived with this feeling like one lives with a shadow, not always seen, but always near. It followed him through cities, through courts, through the long afternoons spent staring at water or light or bone. And though he was surrounded at times by wealth, praise and position, this restlessness was never far behind. He was searching for something. But what was it? Perfection? Truth? Beauty? Perhaps it was all of those things, or perhaps it was something simpler, understanding. A desire not just to know the what, but the why. Why do birds fly the way they do? Why does the smile change when the light shifts? Why does the heart beat in a rhythm that echoes the turning of the stars? Most people ask such questions as children and then slowly stop asking them. Leonardo never stopped, and maybe that's what made him different. He once wrote, "The knowledge of all things is possible." But he also wrote in another moment, "I thought I was learning how to live. I was only learning how to die. These weren't contradictions. They were companions. He knew that understanding was always partial, that mastery was a horizon forever just beyond reach. But the pursuit was everything. There were times when the restlessness grew heavier, when the commissions faded, when the patrons turned to younger artists, when his own body began to betray him. He suffered from fatigue, from melancholy, from illness that would sometimes leave his right side weak and trembling. His hands, once so precise, began to tire, and still he worked, not always for others, not always for glory, but because the questions still lived in him, and while his tools could falter, his wonder did not. In his final years at Clos-Lucé, the days were quieter. The French countryside gave him space. Francesco Melzi was by his side, organizing papers, writing letters, reading aloud. The sound of birds, the rustling of trees, the distant laughter of the court, all wove into the hours like soft threads. Leonardo still rose early. He still sketched when he could. He still turned the pages of his own notebooks as if they belonged to someone else, as if to surprise himself. He seemed to sense that the end was approaching, though he never rushed to meet it. He made peace with it the way he made peace with unfinished projects, not as failure, but as transition, a turning page. He left behind careful instructions for the few possessions that mattered to him. He named Melzi his heir, not just of his belongings, but of his mind. He asked to be buried simply in the chapel of St. Florentine. He gave away clothing, instruments, his vineyard, his books. And in those final decisions you can feel something remarkable. Calm. There was no great fear in Leonardo's final days. Only perhaps a quiet sadness at having to stop before he had finished seeing. But maybe no one ever finishes seeing. He had walked the edge of knowledge his whole life, peering into the space where certainty ends and imagination begins. He had seen farther, more deeply, more tenderly than almost anyone of his time. And yet he still wrote. We know more about the movement of celestial bodies than about the soil underfoot. That humility was his true brilliance, not his paintings, not his machines, but his willingness to remain in awe. Even now, when we read his words or gaze at his work, that awe reaches us. It flows forward through the centuries like a soft wind, reminding us to slow down, to look again, to touch the world not with grasping but with care. Leonardo once wrote that experience was the teacher of all things, but he also knew that not all things could be learned in a single life. He left pages unfinished, ideas untested, paintings undone, and somehow that makes his story even more beautiful. For Leonardo da Vinci didn't just teach us how to draw or build or observe. He taught us how to wonder, and wonder, like light, never ends. So tonight, as you settle deeper into quiet, imagine Leonardo once more. Seated by the window, eyes half closed, the soft hum of memory in the room. He is older now, slower, but the light in him has not dimmed. He still hears questions in the wind, still sees movement in the stillness, still believes that everything, even now, is worth observing. And he turns one last page, not to finish something, but to begin again. In the great quiet that followed Leonardo's death, his works remained like footprints in fresh snow, still visible but softened by time. People remembered the masterpieces first. The Last Supper, faded but legendary. The Mona Lisa, whispered about in corners of courts and salons. The sculptures that never stood, the inventions never built, the notebooks unread, locked behind titles and inheritances. But his presence lingered not only in these works, but in something subtler, in how people began to see. Leonardo had changed the gaze. He had taught the world, without quite meaning to, how to look again, to see not only what is there, but what is beneath, beyond, becoming. This shift didn't happen all at once. It was slow, like dawn creeping over a hillside. But it spread. His influence reached painters, engineers, surgeons, astronomers, and poets alike. Not just in technique, but in approach. Because more than any specific invention, what Leonardo passed down was a method of thinking. He never gave lectures. He never opened a school or wrote a formal treatise. And yet his life became a living curriculum. His notebooks, scattered and cryptic, became manuals for curiosity. His art, restrained and luminous, became meditations on presence. His questions, unanswered, unfinished, became doors for others to open. In this way, Leonardo's legacy did not fossilize. It evolved. You can see it in the works of later painters, in the anatomical precision of Michelangelo, the dramatic staging of Caravaggio, the quiet intensity of Rembrandt. You can feel it in Galileo's insistence on observing the heavens, in Newton's study of light, in Darwin's patient observations of the natural world. All of them, knowingly or not, followed in Leonardo's footsteps, blending art and science, poetry and proof. Even as the world changed, through revolutions and renaissances, wars and discoveries, Leonardo's vision remained strangely modern. In the 20th century, as the pace of progress accelerated, people once again turned to him. Engineers rediscovered his flying machines, artists praised his technique, architects admired his fluid sketches of space, and in classrooms across the world, students opened books and saw Vitruvian Man, arms extended, legs spread, inscribed in a circle and square, as if he were still reaching outward, still asking, what is man's place in the world? That one drawing became emblematic, not just of proportion, but of possibility. It symbolized balance, unity, curiosity. It stood as a reminder that we are not fixed points in a vast cosmos, but moving centers in an ever-shifting field of knowledge. And yet, as his fame grew, so too did the myths. Some painted Leonardo as superhuman, a man of endless genius, flawless and untouchable. But the truth is more beautiful than the myth. He was not perfect. He was often delayed, often distracted, sometimes disappointed. He wrote down recipes for varnish next to theories of lunar reflection. He corrected his own mistakes. He walked away from projects. He began again. And in that rhythm, begin, abandon, return, begin again, we see not failure but fidelity. A fidelity to truth, as he saw it, not a destination, but a process. He never saw art and science as separate things. To Leonardo, a line of poetry could explain a law of physics. The study of a muscle could lead to the invention of a bridge. A cloud formation could whisper the same lesson as a cathedral arch. He believed that everything was connected, and not in a vague, poetic sense, but in a deeply physical, observable way. He once wrote, "Learn how to see. Realize that everything connects to everything else." And that belief, that quiet certainty in the unity of all things, may be his most lasting gift. Today, we live in a world that often celebrates specialization, that rewards speed over depth, that praises productivity more than patience. But Leonardo offers an antidote. He reminds us that the deepest truths come not from rushing forward, but from sitting still, from watching, from listening, from asking questions no one else thought to ask. What does a falling feather tell us about the air? Why does a smile change when it meets the eye? What can the turning of a wheel teach us about time? These are not technical questions. They are human ones, and they are the kinds of questions Leonardo lived inside, not to answer them once and for all, but to walk with them, like old friends, through the quiet corridors of his life. Even now, when we visit a museum and stand before one of his works, the gaze of the Mona Lisa, the half-finished figures of his sketches, the mechanical wings of a dream, we are not merely observers, we are participants. We are invited to wonder, and in wondering we step into his world, not of grandeur or drama, but of soft, persistent inquiry. So tonight imagine this. Leonardo, near the end of his life, walking slowly through a grove of trees outside Clos-Lucé. The sun is low, the leaves rustle gently. He carries no notebook, no tools, just his eyes, just his thoughts. He watches a bird lift from a branch. The beat of its wings, the glide of its fall, the way the air moves behind it. He does not stop to draw, he does not need to. He knows, and still he wonders. Always he wonders. There is something sacred in the act of observation, something Leonardo da Vinci understood more intimately than most. For him, looking was never passive. It was a form of devotion, a ritual, a way of entering into relationship with the world. He did not simply see the surface of things. He entered them, through his eyes, through his pencil, through the quiet curiosity of a mind that never learned to turn away. Observation for Leonardo was not limited to grand scenes. He studied the smallest corners of nature with as much reverence as he gave to kings and saints, a twisted root, the structure of a flower, the glint in the eye of a cat. He believed there was wisdom everywhere, waiting to be discovered, and he trained himself to see it. Not just once, but again and again, as if each leaf or line of bark held a new lesson if one simply paid better attention. He once wrote, "The average human looks without seeing, listens without hearing, Touches without feeling, eats without tasting, moves without physical awareness, inhales without awareness of odor or fragrance, and talks without thinking. It was not a condemnation. It was an invitation to slow down, to look closer, to notice, and in noticing, to learn. One of the most poignant examples of this lies in his botanical sketches. On first glance, they seem simple, drawings of plants, leaves, flowers. But look closer and you see something else. Precision, structure, a soft geometry that mirrors the curves of rivers, mussels, clouds. He wasn't drawing a flower. He was mapping a pattern. And that pattern, from the growth of a dandelion to the spiral of a pine cone, echoed everywhere. Fibonacci sequences, golden ratios, the repetition of nature's own quiet logic. Leonardo saw that. But he didn't just see the beauty. He saw the function. How roots spread for stability, how petals formed to maximize light, how stems bent under weight. Nature to him was not chaos. It was design perfected over time, and it taught him more than any book. That's why, even when he drew fantastical machines, there was always something organic in them. His flying devices borrowed from birds. His bridges followed the curve of trees. His cities were structured like veins and arteries. He didn't invent against nature. He invented with it. And the more he looked, the more he understood that the principles of the small were mirrored in the vast. A drop of water and a planet, a grain of sand and a mountain, the human body and the body of the earth. He once wrote that the earth was a living thing, with bones, breath, blood. He described rivers as veins, oceans as lungs, forests as hair. It was not poetry for its own sake. It was science, spoken in metaphor, because language, he understood, was a bridge. And sometimes, to explain what we observe, we must first find a way to feel it. That was Leonardo's gift. He didn't just collect data, he collected meaning. When he dissected a heart, he didn't see a pump, he saw rhythm. When he painted a face, he didn't just depict anatomy, he painted emotion rising like smoke beneath the skin. To him, knowledge and feeling were not opposites, they were partners. Each refined the other. In his later notebooks, this way of seeing became almost meditative. He wrote fewer calculations, more reflections. He described the quiet of a morning river, the shifting colours in the sky after rain. He watched birds not just for flight mechanics, but for grace, how they paused between beats, how they trusted the air. He admired that, the trust, the surrender to movement. And in those final years, as his own body slowed, Leonardo began to surrender too. Not out of resignation, but out of understanding. He knew that life, like light, was not a thing to grasp. It was a motion to follow, a flow to witness. And even as his hands tired, his gaze never did. He kept observing, always observing. Even in silence, especially in silence. Because silence, to Leonardo, was not emptiness. It was clarity. A place where thoughts could settle, where the eye could rest and still see, where the mind could breathe. So tonight, let yourself imagine that silence. A room half lit by a fading sun. A window open to the sound of birds in the distance. Leonardo sitting still, a piece of paper resting untouched before him. Not drawing, not writing. Just watching the way the light slips along the wall, the way dust floats, the way time moves so softly you'd miss it, unless you noticed. Because he did. And in doing so, he left behind an art or ideas. He left behind a way of seeing, a way of being present. A reminder that even the most extraordinary minds begin with something simple. A breath, a glance, a moment of attention. In the very heart of Leonardo's life, beneath the sketches, beneath the inventions, beneath the titles and honours and unfinished canvases, there existed something deeper still. Something invisible and yet always present. A quiet, unwavering awe. Leonardo da Vinci was, more than anything else, in love with the miracle of existence. He never said it in those exact words. He didn't need to. It was in his eyes, in the lines he drew, in the questions he asked again and again. His entire life was shaped by a sense of wonder so persistent, so sincere, that it never faded with time. If anything, it grew brighter the more he saw. And he saw everything. He saw the mathematics in shadows, the choreography in how muscles pulled against bone, the story in a single drop of water rolling down a window pane. He looked at a snail and imagined the spiral of galaxies. He listened to wind and thought of breath. The world was not just his subject. It was his companion. That is what made his curiosity different. It was not hungry for power or possession. It was devoted, full of reverence. He did not look at nature to conquer it or even to master it. He looked at it as one might look at a beloved, patiently, gently, over and over, trying to understand it just a little more. In one of his quieter notebook entries, he wrote, "There are 3 classes of people: those who see when they are shown, and those who do not see." He didn't say this with arrogance. He simply knew how rare it was to truly see, to notice the unfolding of petals in the spring, or the way a child's hand curls in sleep. He knew that to witness the world was a kind of sacred act, one available to all, but practiced by few. And he practiced it every day. He observed not just things, but moments. A fish breaking the surface of a pond, the sudden flick of an eye when someone hears their name, the moment of hesitation before a smile begins. These details, so easily missed, became the raw material of his art, his science, his soul. Even his machines were born of wonder, not ambition. His flying machines were not attempts to dominate the sky. They were love letters to it. They were what happens when a man stares at a bird for so long that he forgets which species he belongs to. Leonardo did not want to escape the earth. He wanted to understand how the air held a wing aloft and what it meant to trust it. He once wrote, "Once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward." And though he never left the ground himself, he gave others the means, in time, through study, through dreams, to one day do so. But perhaps most touching of all was his belief that the smallest details contained the greatest truths. He didn't need cathedrals or cataclysms to feel awe. A puddle would do. A pine cone. The way light filtered through grape leaves in the afternoon. He taught us that the infinite often hides in plain sight, in the curve of a shell, in the arc of a question, in the spaces between words. And because he noticed those things, he helped us notice them too. Even now, hundreds of years later, Leonardo's awe is contagious. We see it in how people still gather around the Mona Lisa, waiting for something they can't quite name. We feel it when we look at his anatomical drawings and realize he was not trying to own the body, but to honor it. We hear it in the silence that follows his name, that pause, that breath, before someone speaks of him, and we carry it with us, whether we know it or not. When we pause to admire the swirl of cream in coffee, when we look up at the moon and imagine how far it is. When we trace the veins in a leaf with our finger, these are not accidents, they are echoes, and Leonardo's life was one long echo of wonder. So tonight, imagine him once more, not in his studio, not among scrolls and sketches, but outside, under a tree, looking up through its branches at the sky beyond. The stars are just beginning to appear. A breeze stirs the grass. He has no notebook, no brush, just his eyes, just the deep, wordless gratitude of being here, alive, witnessing. And maybe in that moment the question doesn't matter. Maybe all that matters is the looking and the awe that follows. In the penultimate moments of his life's great arc, Leonardo da Vinci stood not at the summit of achievement, but at the edge of mystery. He had charted so much, sketched the contours of bodies, machines, rivers, thoughts, and yet, the closer he came to the horizon, the more he seemed to understand how much he did not know. And he welcomed that. He once wrote, "The noblest pleasure is the joy of understanding." But in his final years, it's as if he discovered a second, quieter truth, that even more noble was the joy of not understanding, the joy of being humbled by the sheer vastness of the unknown. By then he had learned to live within that space. He no longer rushed to finish drawings or assert conclusions. He had nothing to prove, no more works to present to patrons, no court to impress, only time and the pages that remained blank. That time was a gift, so was the blankness. At Clos-Lucé, where he spent his final years under the protection of King Francis I, Leonardo was given something he had rarely enjoyed in his earlier life: peace. The noise of the world, with its rivalries and demands, grew softer. The pace of each day slowed. His studio became not a place of production, but of meditation. He still drew, still wrote, but often he would simply sit by the window and watch the day pass. The Loire Valley spread out before him, green, gentle, filled with shifting skies and winding rivers. It reminded him of Tuscany, the curves of the land, the way light settled on the hills in the early morning, the hush of the trees. There, in the folds of that landscape, Leonardo seemed to settle into himself. He took long walks when he could, sometimes with Melzi, sometimes alone. He visited the royal court occasionally, always greeted with respect, sometimes even with awe. Francois held him in deep regard, not as an artisan or entertainer, but as a sage. Their conversations were not about decoration, but about philosophy, nature, the movement of stars. And yet Leonardo rarely spoke as a master. He had no interest in being a guru. He remained, as always, a student, a watcher. He would listen more than he talked, and when he did speak, his words were often laced with humour, with humility. He knew how much he had seen, but he also knew how much had been hidden from him. That balance between confidence and wonder is what made his presence so singular. People were drawn to him not because he was loud, but because he was quiet, in a way that made others want to be quieter too. He still kept his notebooks close, still made careful observations about water and air and anatomy, still considered how the heart pumped blood, how the moon reflected light. He returned to his old questions as if visiting dear friends. He did not expect final answers, only deeper forms of the same question. In this way, Leonardo aged gracefully, not by clinging to youth or chasing legacy, but by deepening his sense of presence. There is a letter, dated not long before his death, in which a visitor describes seeing Leonardo seated outside, watching a spider build its web. He sat for nearly an hour without moving, simply observing the delicate movements, the glistening strands, the structure of the trap, and the patience of its weaver. He was not preparing a study, not composing a fable, he was simply watching. And perhaps in that moment he understood everything, not in a way that could be written down, not in diagrams or ratios, but in stillness. He had spent his whole life tracing the spiral of shells, of water, of thought, and now at the end he had followed it inward, toward quiet, toward surrender, not defeat, not sadness, peace. He did not leave the world in a blaze of declarations, he left it gently. One breath after the next, a page turned, a glance lifted, a hand held still. And yet, he left behind a wake so deep that it would ripple across centuries. He died on May 2nd, 1519. The moment was not marked by great fanfare. There were no trumpets, no ceremony, just the stillness of a spring morning. The kind of morning he would have loved, soft light through the shutters, the sound of wind in the trees, a bird passing overhead. And so tonight, as we near the end of this long and quiet journey, let us linger for a moment with him in that stillness. The candle burns low, the ink is dry. Outside, the grass moves in small waves. Leonardo rests not with regret, but with recognition, that to have looked so closely, to have asked so deeply, is enough. There is nothing more to finish, only the silence that follows, and within that silence, the echo of a lifetime of wonder. And now we arrive gently at the final part of this story, though perhaps final is not the right word. Because a life like Leonardo da Vinci's does not truly end. It transforms. It continues in echoes, in influence, in questions passed from one mind to the next. In that sense, Leonardo has never really been gone. He is still unfolding, still teaching, still reminding us to look closer, to linger longer, to live with open eyes. After his death, the world did not fully know what it had lost, or rather, what it had been given. In the years that followed, his works passed from hand to hand, sometimes guarded, sometimes scattered. His notebooks were hidden away in trunks and drawers, their mirror-scripted pages puzzling to most. His paintings travelled, were restored, debated, adored. Some of his ideas faded into obscurity, while others re-emerged centuries later, sparking revelations in fields he never lived to see. And yet, like seeds sown in secret, they grew. Architects borrowed his sense of space. Engineers looked to his machines. Anatomists revisited his drawings with astonishment. Artists studied the way he captured emotion with a single soft line. Pilots found in his dreams of flight the seeds of their own. And thinkers, poets, seekers of all kinds returned to him not for answers, but for a way of asking. His life became not just a memory, but a mirror in which others saw the possibility of uniting intellect with imagination, science with art, reason with emotion. He embodied the best of what we might become, not because he was superhuman, but because he stayed so deeply, sincerely human. Curious, flawed, unfinished, dreaming. He was, in many ways, ahead of his time, but he also belonged to all time. In a modern world that often moves too fast, Leonardo reminds us of the power of slowness, the value of looking, really looking, of drawing not just to illustrate, but to understand, of asking questions we cannot immediately answer, of living not for accolades or applause, but for insight, for the quiet joy of discovery. And in a time so often fractured into specializations, he reminds us that knowledge is not a series of separate rooms, but one great echoing hall, with doors leading from astronomy to anatomy, from engineering to poetry, from geometry to the human soul. Even now, hundreds of years later, his fingerprints are everywhere. In the way we teach, the way we design, the way we imagine. He did not build an empire, he left no dynasty, but he gave us something more lasting, a vision of what it means to be fully alive to the world, to walk through it not with judgment or certainty, but with wonder, with humility, with awe. And in that way, his life remains a kind of light, steady, soft, eternal. So if you ever find yourself paused beside a tree, watching how the leaves tremble in the breeze, or if you notice how shadow curves along a staircase, or if you suddenly wonder how birds navigate the wind, or how your own hand knows how to reach without thinking, that is Leonardo. Still whispering, still pointing gently toward the miracle of attention, still asking you to look, not with haste, but with love. And maybe, just maybe, to pick up a pencil, or ask a question, or follow an idea not because it's useful, but because it's beautiful. Tonight, as sleep begins to gather around you, let his story settle with you like a soft wind. You've walked with him from the hills of Vinci, through the studios of Florence, the courts of Milan, the palaces of France. You've stood beside him as he observed the flight of birds, the shape of clouds, the rhythm of a heart. You've watched him wonder, watch him fail, watch him begin again. And now, as he rests at last, so can you. Close your eyes. Let your breath be slow. The world, in all its mystery, will still be here tomorrow. And perhaps if you wake with even a little more curiosity, a little more tenderness for the shape of things, a little more time given to wonder, then Leonardo lives on. Not just in memory, but in you.